If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Redfeather, and I've been a ranger at Sequoia National Park for almost 10 years now. People say it's one of the most beautiful places on Earth, and they're right. The ancient trees here are so tall they seem to touch the sky, their trunks so wide you could drive a car through them. It feels like walking through a cathedral made by nature itself. But lately something's been off. It started in the fall of 1991. The weather had turned strange, cold fronts, sweeping through the park, leaving frost on the sequoia trunks. That's not normal for this time of year. Even stranger were the sounds. When the temperature dropped, the forest seemed to hum, like it was alive in a way I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but there was something deeper, something hollow, like the ground itself was breathing. I've always been a man of science. Before becoming a ranger, I studied geology. California's fault systems were my specialty. I know this land better than most people ever will. But I also grew up hearing stories from my family, Yokut and Miwok elders who talked about spirits and the earth and guardians of the forest. As a kid, I thought those stories were just myths. But now I'm not so sure. One morning, while surveying seismic activity near one of the older groves, I noticed something strange. The readings on my equipment showed vibrations coming from deep underground. Not earthquakes exactly, but rhythmic pulses that didn't make sense. They seemed to be concentrated under specific trees, almost like something was moving beneath them. I chalked it up to faulty equipment and moved on. But then there were the claw marks. I was hiking through one of the less visited areas of the park when I saw them. Long, deep gouges carved into a sequoia trunk, about 200 feet above the ground. There was no way any animal could have reached that high, and there were no branches nearby to climb from. It was as if something had floated up there and slashed at the tree with claws bigger than my hand. That's when I started keeping notes, mapping out these strange occurrences and trying to find patterns. Disappearances had been reported in nearby logging areas outside park boundaries, and they seemed to line up with seismic events here in Sequoia. Something wasn't right. I didn't know it then, but I was standing at the edge of something far bigger than I could have imagined, a mystery that would change everything I thought I knew about this land. I couldn't get those claw marks out of my head. They didn't belong there, not in a place like this. The forest had always been peaceful to me, a safe haven, but now it felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The seismic readings kept bothering me too. I decided to go back to the grove where I'd first noticed the strange vibrations. This time I brought better equipment. A ground-penetrating radar that could give me a clearer picture of what was beneath the surface. What I found made my stomach twist. Underneath the grove was a network of tunnels, massive, perfectly round passages that stretched for miles. They weren't natural, not by any stretch of the imagination. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and there were no signs of water erosion or animal activity. It was like something had carved them out deliberately. But what could do that, and why? I started hiking deeper into the forest, looking for more clues. That's when I found another tree with claw marks. This one even higher than the last. The gouges were fresh, the bark still splintered and raw. I ran my fingers over them and felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever had done this wasn't just strong, it was huge. As I stood there staring at the marks, the forest seemed to grow quieter around me. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the faint sound of my own breathing and something else. A low hum, so deep I could feel it in my chest more than hear it. It was coming from the ground. I crouched down and pressed my hand against the earth. The hum grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat. I couldn't explain it. It felt alive, like the forest itself was trying to tell me something. The next day, I decided to talk to some of the tribal elders in the area. They'd always been kind to me, sharing stories and traditions whenever I asked. But when I told them about the tunnels and claw marks, their faces grew serious. One elder, a woman named Eliza, pulled me aside and spoke in a hushed tone. "You need to be careful," she said. "This land is older than you think, and it has guardians. Guardians? I asked. She nodded slowly. We call them root walkers. They protect the forest, but they don't see things the way we do. If they think you stir a threat, they still stop you. I wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, but something about her tone made me pause. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was warning me. Before I left, she handed me an old eagle bone whistle and told me to keep it with me at all times. It might help, she said simply. That night, as I sat in my cabin going over my notes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hum from earlier still echoed in my mind, steady and unrelenting. I didn't know it yet, but things were about to get much worse. The next morning, I woke up to frost on my cabin windows. The chill had settled deeper into the forest, and the hum I'd felt the day before seemed stronger now, almost vibrating through the ground as I walked. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening here wasn't just in my head, it was real. I decided to focus on mapping the seismic activity. If I could figure out where the vibrations were strongest, maybe I could find some answers. As I marked points on my map, a pattern started to emerge. The strongest pulses were always near the oldest trees, the ones that had stood for thousands of years. It was like something underground was drawn to them. I remembered what Eliza had said about root walkers, but it still didn't make sense to me. Guardians of the forest? It sounded like something out of a storybook, and yet, the more I thought about it, the more it fit. These tunnels, these claw marks, they weren't random. They were part of something bigger. I decided to visit one of the groves where the vibrations were strongest. As I approached, I felt the hum again, deep and steady, like a heartbeat under my feet. The air was colder here, and the trees seemed taller, their shadows stretching longer than they should have. I took out the eagle bone whistle Eliza had given me and held it in my hand. It felt warm, almost alive, as if it wanted me to use it. I hesitated for a moment before blowing into it softly. The sound that came out wasn't what I expected. It wasn't sharp or piercing, it was low and resonant, like a song meant for the earth itself. As the note faded, the hum beneath me grew louder, vibrating through my boots and into my chest. Then, silence. For a moment, everything stopped. The hum, the wind, even the distant sound of birds. The forest felt frozen in time. And then I saw it. At first, it was just movement. A ripple in the shadows between two massive sequoias, but as I stared, something began to take shape. It was huge, its body blending into the bark and roots around it like camouflage. Its legs looked like twisted branches, its back like polished stone. Antler-like protrusions rose from its head, shifting and rearranging themselves as it moved. I didn't breathe, I didn't move. All I could do was watch as this thing, this root walker, stepped forward from the trees and stared right at me. Its eyes weren't like anything I'd ever seen before. Dark and endless, like looking into a bottomless well. They didn't seem angry or aggressive, just aware. I gripped the whistle tightly in my hand but didn't blow it again. Somehow, I knew that making another sound might provoke it. The root walker stood there for what felt like an eternity before turning away and disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. It moved so smoothly, it was almost liquid, flowing between the trees until it vanished completely. I stayed there for a long time after it was gone, trying to process what I'd just seen. This wasn't just some animal or geological anomaly. It was something ancient and alive in a way I couldn't explain. When I finally made my way back to my cabin, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely write down what had happened. The claw marks, the tunnels, Eliza's warnings, they all made sense now. This wasn't just a forest, it was a territory, and something powerful was protecting it. But why now? Why had it shown itself to me? And what did it want? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark, endless eyes staring back at me. The hum was still there too, faint but constant, like a reminder that the forest wasn't done with me yet. The next day, I tried to focus on my usual ranger duties, checking trails, clearing debris, but my mind kept drifting back to the root walker. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for something. And then, as if to confirm my fears, the park radio crackled with an emergency call. "Marcus, We got a situation near the logging site, came the voice of one of the other rangers. A crew member SIP's gone missing. We need backup. I grabbed my gear and drove out to the edge of the park where logging operations had been causing trouble for months. The area felt wrong as soon as I arrived. The trees here were younger, smaller, and the ground was scarred with tire tracks and machinery marks. It was like the land had been wounded. The logging crew was gathered near a massive sequoia at the edge of their site. They looked shaken, their faces pale, and their voices hushed. One of them pointed toward the tree and said, "It took him." "What do you mean it took him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He pointed again, his hand trembling. Something came out of the tree, grabbed him, and pulled him inside. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Trees don't just swallow people, but then again, nothing about this place had made sense lately. I stepped closer to the sequoia and felt it immediately, the hum stronger than ever. The air around the tree seemed heavier, colder, like it was pressing down on me. The bark was smooth except for a single spot where claw marks had gouged deep into the wood. And then it happened. The ground beneath me trembled, and before I could react, the tree split open with a sound like thunder. From inside came the root walker, its massive form flowing out like water before solidifying in front of us. The loggers screamed and ran in every direction, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place as it turned its head toward me. Its antlers shifted again, rearranging themselves into a shape that almost looked human. It didn't attack, not yet, but its presence was overwhelming. The hum grew louder until it felt like my whole body was vibrating with it. I couldn't tell if it was warning me or testing me. Then it moved fast and fluid toward one of the fleeing loggers. Before anyone could stop it, one of its branch-like limbs wrapped around him and pulled him back toward the tree. The man's screams echoed through the forest before being swallowed by silence. I gripped the eagle bone whistle in my hand so tightly it hurt. This thing wasn't just protecting the forest, it was punishing anyone who threatened it. When it turned back toward me, I thought I was done for, but instead of attacking, it stopped and stared again, its dark eyes boring into mine like it was searching for something. And then, it disappeared. It flowed back into the tree as quickly as it had come, leaving nothing behind but claw marks and silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before finally forcing myself to move. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold my radio as I called in what had happened. But what could I say? That a living tree monster had swallowed a man whole. No one would believe me, not unless they saw it for themselves. As I drove back to my cabin that night, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about logging or seismic activity anymore. Whatever this thing was, this root walker, it wasn't going to stop until we listened to what the forest wanted. The next few days were a blur. The missing logger was officially listed as disappeared, but I knew the truth. I couldn't tell anyone, not the other rangers, not the authorities. They'd think I was crazy, but I couldn't let it go either. Something had to be done before more people got hurt. I spent hours poring over my notes, trying to find a way to stop this thing, or at least understand it. The tunnels, the claw marks, the hum, they all pointed to one thing. The root walker wasn't just a creature, it was part of the forest itself, tied to the land in ways I couldn't fully grasp. And it wasn't going to stop until we stopped pushing too far. I remembered what Eliza had said about the eagle bone whistle and decided to visit her again. When I told her what I'd seen, she didn't look surprised, just sad. "You Sep's seen it now," she said quietly. "That means it's Sep's watching you." "What does it want?" I asked. She shook her head. "It doesn't Sep think like we do. It's Sep's ancient, older than any of us. It protects the forest, but its Sep's been disturbed, corrupted by everything we Sep done to this land." "Can it be stopped?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Not stopped, but maybe reasoned with." Reasoned with? The idea sounded impossible, but I didn't have any better options. She handed me a small pouch filled with crushed minerals and herbs, explaining that they were used in old rituals to calm the spirits of the land. "Use this with the whistle," she said. "It might listen." That night, I went back to the grove where I'd first seen the root walker. The hum was stronger than ever, vibrating through the ground like a warning. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I crouched near one of the ancient sequoias and sprinkled the crushed minerals around its base. Then, with trembling hands, I raised the whistle to my lips and blew. The sound that came out was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo through the entire forest. The hum beneath me grew louder in response, and then silence. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the ground began to shake. The root walker emerged from the shadows again, its massive form flowing between trees like liquid before solidifying in front of me. Its antlers shifted and rearranged themselves as it moved closer, its dark eyes locked on mine. I didn't run. I couldn't. Instead, I blew the whistle again, holding my ground as its presence pressed down on me like a weight. And then something strange happened. The hum changed. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice, deep and ancient, speaking in tones that weren't words but feelings. Somehow, I understood what it was saying. It wasn't instead angry. It was hurt. The logging, the seismic disturbances, the destruction of its home, it had been pushed too far for too long. It wasn't just protecting the forest, it was mourning it. I understand, I said aloud, even though I wasn't set sure if it could hear me. We shall stop. We shall leave this place alone. The root walker stared at me for what felt like an eternity before retreating back into the shadows of the trees. The hum faded with it until there was nothing left but silence. I didn't know if it believed me, or if it would give us another chance, but I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. After the encounter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been given a warning, a chance to fix things before it was too late. But how could I convince anyone to stop logging or disturbing the forest without sounding insane? I needed proof, something undeniable that would make people listen. The next morning, I returned to the grove with a team of rangers under the guise of conducting geological surveys. I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I couldn't, but I did show them the tunnels beneath the trees. The radar images were enough to raise eyebrows. "This isn't natural," one of them muttered, staring at the screen. We followed the strongest seismic readings deeper into the forest, and that's when we found it, a cave system hidden beneath one of the oldest sequoias. The entrance was partially collapsed, but we managed to squeeze through, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside, the air was cold and damp, and the walls were covered in strange marking symbols carved into the stone that looked ancient, almost like petroglyphs. My heart stopped when I saw one of them, a handprint identical to the birthmark on my forearm. "What is this place?" one of the rangers asked, his voice echoing in the cavern. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the hum. The same deep vibration I'd felt before, only louder now. It seemed to pulse through the walls, growing stronger as we moved deeper into the cave. And then the ground shook. The root walker emerged from a tunnel ahead of us, its massive form filling the space like a living shadow. The rangers panicked, scrambling for the exit, but I stayed where I was. Somehow, I knew running wouldn't help. I raised the eagle bone whistle to my lips and blew as hard as I could. The sound echoed through the cave, resonating with the hum until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating. The root walker stopped and turned toward me. Its antlers shifted again, forming shapes that looked almost like words, like it was trying to communicate. "I understand," I said again, my voice shaking. "We shall leave this place alone. We shall protect it." The hum changed again, softer now, almost like a sigh. The root walker stepped back into the shadows and disappeared into another tunnel. The ground stopped shaking, and silence filled the cave once more. When we emerged from the cave hours later, I knew what I had to do. Over the next few weeks, I worked tirelessly to convince park officials to designate certain areas as off-limits, untouched zones where no logging or development could occur. It wasn't easy, but with help from Eliza and other tribal elders, we made progress. The rituals she had mentioned were revived too, ceremonies held at key locations in the park to honor and calm the spirits of the land. They were presented as cultural demonstrations for visitors, but served a much deeper purpose. As for me, my work wasn't done. Every few months, I conducted geological surveys in those untouched zones, not for science but for communication. The eagle bone whistle became my lifeline, a way to keep in touch with something far older and more powerful than any of us. The root walker hasn't appeared since that day in the cave, but sometimes when I'm alone in those groves, I feel its presence, a faint hum beneath my feet, or a shadow that moves just out of sight. It's still there, watching and waiting. It's been years since that day in the cave, but I still think about it every time I walk through the forest. The park feels different now, quieter, calmer, like the land is finally starting to heal. The untouched zones we fought for remain protected, and the logging operations near the park boundaries have been scaled back. It's not perfect, but it's a start. The rituals Eliza and the elders revived have become a regular part of the park's schedule. Tourists see them as cultural events, but those of us who know the truth understand their real purpose. They're not just ceremonies, they're promises. Promises to respect the land and keep it safe. As for me, I've changed too. Ever since that encounter, I've developed a strange sensitivity to seismic activity. I can feel vibrations in the ground before they show up on any equipment, and sometimes I know when an earthquake is coming days in advance. It's like the land is speaking to me now, in ways I never thought possible. I still carry the eagle bone whistle with me everywhere I go. It's become more than just a tool. It's a reminder of what happened and what's still out there. Every few months, I visit the untouched zones alone, blowing the whistle softly and waiting for a response. Most of the time, there's nothing but silence. But every now and then, I feel it, the hum beneath my feet, or a shadow that moves where it shouldn't. The root walker hasn't shown itself again, but I know it's still there, watching, waiting. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me, if it knows that I kept my promise. Maybe that's why it hasn't come back. Or maybe it's just waiting for another warning sign, another reason to rise from the earth and remind us who really owns this land. I don't have all the answers, but one thing is clear. This forest isn't just trees and soil. It's alive in ways we can't fully understand, and it deserves our respect. So if you ever find yourself walking through Sequoia National Park and feel a hum beneath your feet or see shadows moving where they shouldn't, stop and listen. The land might be trying to tell you something. My name is Cassandra Lawson, but everyone calls me Cass. I'm a park ranger at Everglades National Park in Florida. It's not exactly where I thought I'd end up when I was younger. I used to work for the CDC as an epidemiologist. That feels like a lifetime ago now. I left that job after blowing the whistle on a corporate cover-up that nearly killed hundreds of people. Turns out, doing the right thing doesn't always make you popular. After that, I needed a fresh start somewhere far away from labs and suits, so I ended up here. The Everglades is a strange, beautiful place. It's not like anywhere else in the world. Miles of sawgrass prairies stretch out under the blazing sun, dotted with cypress swamps and mangroves. The air smells earthy, like wet soil mixed with salt water. It's peaceful most days, but there's always something lurking just beneath the surface. Alligators, snakes, or even invasive species that don't belong here. You learn quickly that nature isn't always kind. This summer has been brutal. The drought is worse than anything anyone remembers. The heat is so oppressive, it feels like it's pressing down on your chest, and mirages shimmer on the horizon like ghosts. Sometimes thunderstorms roll in out of nowhere, dumping rain for 5 minutes before vanishing as fast as they came. The park feels off lately. Tourists are still coming in droves, but some of them have gone missing over the past few weeks. That's not unheard of. People get lost out here all the time. But something about these disappearances doesn't sit right with me. I've been spending my days documenting changes in the ecosystem. The drought has brought out strange growth patterns in the plants, clusters of vegetation blooming where they shouldn't be, spreading faster than normal. I've been taking photos and samples to study later with my microbiology kit. It's something I designed myself back when I worked at the CDC. It lets me analyze DNA on the spot, which comes in handy when dealing with invasive species. Yesterday, while hiking through one of the sawgrass prairies near an old airboat trail, I noticed something odd, a patch of plants that didn't look quite right. They were taller than usual, almost unnaturally green despite the drought. When I stepped closer to take a picture, I swear I saw them move, not like swaying in the wind, but shifting as if they were alive and watching me. I shook it off as my imagination playing tricks on me and kept walking. But now I'm not so sure it was just my mind. The next morning, I decided to head back to the area where I'd seen the strange plants. Something about them kept nagging at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I packed my gear, my camera, my microbiology kit, and plenty of water, and set off early, before the heat became unbearable. The air was heavy, even in the morning, the kind of heat that makes it hard to breathe. As I walked through the sawgrass, everything felt too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds chirping or the distant croak of a frog, but today there was nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry ground. After about an hour of hiking, I spotted something up ahead, a glint of metal shining in the sun. When I got closer, I realized it was an airboat. It looked abandoned, sitting half sunk in the mud like it had been there for days. That wasn't unusual. People sometimes left their boats behind when they broke down, but what was unusual were the plants growing all over it. The vegetation looked like regular swamp grass at first glance, but as I leaned in for a closer look, I noticed something strange. The leaves were thicker than they should have been, almost fleshy, and they had this glossy sheen that reminded me of wet skin. They were wrapped around the boat like they were holding it in place. I pulled out my camera and snapped a few pictures before taking a sample with my gloves on. The moment I cut a piece off, I swear I felt the plant twitch in my hand. It startled me so much that I nearly dropped it. "Calm down, Cass," I muttered to myself. "It's just a plant." I placed the sample into a sterile container and grabbed my microbiology kit to run a quick test. The results didn't make any sense. The DNA wasn't just plant, it had traces of animal DNA mixed in. That shouldn't be possible. Plants and animals don't share DNA like that. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to figure out what could have caused this. Maybe it was contamination from nearby toxic waste dumping. There had been rumors about illegal dumping in the area for years, but nothing had ever been proven. As I packed up my gear and got ready to leave, something else caught my eye, a trail of footprints leading away from the boat. They were faint, but fresh enough that they couldn't have been more than a day old. Whoever had been here must have left in a hurry because their steps were uneven, like they were stumbling or running. I decided to follow them. The trail led me deeper into the wetlands, where the ground became softer and harder to navigate. The plants around me started to look wrong again. They were taller here and clustered together in ways that didn't feel natural. Some of them even seemed to pulse slightly, like they were breathing. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and take another picture when I noticed something strange on one of the leaves nearby. Tiny droplets of liquid that looked like dew but smelled sweet, almost like honey. My instincts told me not to touch it. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling sound behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. Slowly, I turned around expecting to see an animal or maybe another person, but there was nothing there, just more plants swaying gently in the still air. It felt like they were watching me. I didn't want to stick around any longer than I had to. Something about the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. The rustling sound hadn't stopped, but it wasn't coming from any one direction. It seemed to be everywhere, like the plants themselves were moving. I followed the footprints further into the wetlands, my heart pounding with every step. The trail led me to a clearing, surrounded by tall cypress trees. At first glance, it looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. The ground was covered in patches of that strange vegetation again, the kind with glossy leaves and pulsing stems. And then I saw it. In the middle of the clearing was a man, or at least what was left of him. He was lying face down in the mud, his body tangled in vines that seemed to grow straight out of him. His skin was pale and stretched tight, almost translucent, and his arms were wrapped in thick green tendrils that pulsed like veins. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't just that he was dead, it was how unnatural he looked, like he'd been absorbed into the plants. I forced myself to take a step closer, my hands shaking as I reached for my camera. I needed proof of this. whatever this was. As I raised the lens to my eye, the man's body twitched. I gasped and stumbled back, nearly dropping my camera. The vines around him tightened, pulling his body upright in a jerky motion. His head turned toward me, and for a split second, I saw his face, or what used to be his face. His features were distorted, half covered in plant matter that seemed to grow out of his skin. His eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets filled with green light. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, a sickly sweet scent filled the air, the same honey-like smell I'd noticed earlier. My head started to spin, and for a moment, I felt calm, too calm. It was like every instinct telling me to run had been muted. But then I remembered the spores. The sweet smell wasn't natural. It was some kind of pheromone meant to disarm me. I held my breath and stumbled backward, trying to get away from him, or it. The vines around his body began to unravel, reaching toward me like fingers. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the sawgrass without looking back. My boots sank into the mud with every step, slowing me down as the rustling sound grew louder behind me. It wasn't just coming from him anymore, it was coming from everywhere. The plants were moving. I didn't stop until I reached higher ground near one of the park's observation towers. My chest burned from running, and my hands shook as I grabbed my radio to call for help. But when I pressed the button, all I heard was static. "Come on," I whispered desperately, trying again and again. The radio stayed silent. That's when I noticed something on my arm. A small red patch just above my wrist where some of the spores must have landed earlier. It itched like crazy, and when I pulled off my glove to get a better look, I saw tiny green threads spreading under my skin. I stared at my arm, my breath caught in my throat. The green threads looked like veins, but they weren't mine. They were spreading just beneath the surface of my skin, slow but steady. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Freaking out wouldn't help me now. I needed to figure out what was happening to me, to the plants, to everything. I climbed the observation tower to get away from the ground, hoping it would give me a moment to think. From up there, I could see the vast expanse of the Everglades stretching out in every direction. Normally it was beautiful, a sea of green under the wide open sky, but today, something felt different. The patches of strange vegetation weren't just scattered here and there, they were everywhere, spreading like a web across the landscape. I pulled out my microbiology kit and swabbed the patch on my arm, desperate for answers. The results came back almost instantly, and they made my stomach drop. The DNA wasn't just plant, it was a mix of plant and human. Somehow, the spores were merging with my cells, changing me from the inside out. I leaned against the railing, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What was this thing? Where had it come from? And how far had it already spread? Then I remembered something I'd read in an old park report years ago. Something about certain areas of the Everglades that local indigenous tribes avoided during droughts. They called them hungry grounds. At the time, I thought it was just folklore, stories meant to scare people away from dangerous parts of the swamp. But now I wasn't so sure. I needed more information. There was an old Seminole guide named Joseph who worked with the Park Service sometimes. He knew these wetlands better than anyone else and might have answers about what I was dealing with. If anyone could help me understand this nightmare, it was him. But first, I had to get back to the ranger station. Climbing down from the tower was harder than going up. My legs felt weak, and my arm throbbed where the green threads had spread further. Every step felt like a battle against whatever was growing inside me. When I finally reached my truck parked near one of the trails, I noticed something strange. The tires were covered in that same glossy plant growth I'd seen earlier. It hadn't been there when I left it this morning. I grabbed a machete from the back and hacked at the vines until they fell away, revealing deep scratches in the metal underneath. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just growing. It was thinking. It knew how to trap me here. I drove back to the station as fast as I could without getting stuck in the mud. When I got there, Joseph was waiting for me on the porch, like he'd known I'd come looking for him. "You've seen it," he said before I could even open my mouth. I nodded, too shaken to say much. Joseph sighed and motioned for me to sit down. We call it Sut the hunger bloom, SIP. It's been here longer than any of us, longer than this land itself. It sleeps most years, but when conditions are right, droughts like this one, it wakes up. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It sets not just one thing, he said slowly. It sets a colony, a living network that stretches across miles of wetlands. It feeds on anything it can catch, animals, people, even plants, and takes pieces of them into itself. I showed him my arm and asked if there was a way to stop it. Joseph frowned deeply, but didn't thou look surprised? You're lucky you caught it early, he said grimly. Once it takes root inside you, well, let's just say most don't make it. He handed me a small pouch filled with crushed herbs and bark. This one's set to cure you, he said, but it might slow it down long enough for you to figure out what to do next. What about stopping it? I asked desperately. Joseph shook his head. You can stop something like this, not completely, but if you can find its heart, the place where it sits strongest, you might be able to weaken it enough to keep it from spreading. His words sent a chill through me. The idea of going deeper into those wetlands to find whatever was at the center of this thing was terrifying. But what choice did I have? If this thing kept growing unchecked, there wouldn't be an Everglades left, or anything else for that matter. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man in the clearing, his body twisted and consumed by vines. I felt the green threads crawling under my skin, spreading slowly but surely. Joseph's herbs helped dull the itching, but they couldn't stop the inevitable. If I didn't act soon, I'd end up just like him. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was going to find the heart of this thing, the place where it was strongest, and stop it. It was a crazy plan, but there wasn't another option. If I didn't try, the hunger bloom would keep spreading until it consumed everything. I packed my gear carefully, my camera, my machete, Joseph's herbs, and a portable speaker loaded with sound frequencies that I hoped would disrupt the organism. Joseph had told me that certain vibrations could weaken it during its reproductive cycle, though he wasn't sure how effective they'd be. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. The journey into the wetlands felt different this time. The air was heavier, thicker, with that sickly sweet smell that made my head spin. The vegetation around me seemed alive, not just swaying in the breeze, but shifting toward me as I walked. Every step felt like a test of courage. After hours of hiking, I reached an area Joseph had warned me about, a part of the wetlands so remote that even experienced guides avoided it. The plants here were taller than anywhere else, their stems thick and glossy like polished wood. The ground was soft and spongy underfoot, covered in patches of moss that pulsed faintly. And then I saw it. At the center of the clearing was a massive cluster of vines and roots tangled together into a shape that almost looked human, like a giant figure crouched in the mud. Its surface shimmered with droplets of liquid that glowed faintly in the dim light. This had to be the heart of the hunger bloom. I took a step closer, my hands shaking as I reached for my camera. But before I could take a picture, the figure moved. It wasn't fast, more like a slow ripple spreading through its body, but it was enough to make me freeze in place. The vines began to unravel, stretching out toward me like fingers. The sweet scent grew stronger, and for a moment I felt calm again. Too calm. I knew what it was doing. It wanted me to let my guard down, to trust it enough to step closer, but I wasn't going to fall for that. I grabbed the speaker from my bag and turned it on, blasting the sound frequencies Joseph had given me. The effect was immediate. The figure recoiled, its vines snapping back like whips as a high-pitched hum filled the air. But it wasn't set enough to stop it. The ground beneath me began to shake as more vines erupted from the mud, reaching for me from every direction. One of them wrapped around my leg before I could react, pulling me down into the muck. I fought back with everything I had, swinging my machete wildly as I tried to free myself. The blade cut through the vine easily enough, but more kept coming, dozens of them, all moving with purpose. That's when I realized what I had to do. If this thing was connected across miles of wetlands like Joseph said, then disrupting its heart might not be enough. I needed to get inside its network to understand how it worked from within. It was a terrible idea, maybe even suicidal, but there wasn't another choice. I grabbed one of Joseph's herbs and crushed it against my arm where the green threads had spread further. The pain was sharp and immediate as the plant reacted violently to the herb's chemicals, but instead of pulling away, I let it happen. I let myself become part of its network. The world around me shifted instantly. I wasn't standing in the clearing anymore. I was somewhere else. Somewhere vast and endless memories flooded into my mind. Not mine, but those of countless others who had been consumed by this thing over centuries. Their voices echoed in my head, pleading for release or whispering secrets about its nature. The hunger bloom wasn't just alive, it was intelligent. It didn't just feed on people. It absorbed their thoughts and emotions too, using them to grow stronger and smarter over time. Through sheer force of will, I focused on one thought, disrupting its reproductive cycle before it could spread further. Using what little control I had left over my own body, I activated the speaker again and blasted the sound frequencies directly into its network. The effect was catastrophic. The vines around me writhed violently as parts of its body began to collapse inward like a dying star. The memories in my head faded one by one until there was nothing left but silence. When I woke up hours later, the clearing was empty except for patches of dead vegetation scattered across the ground. My arm still burned where the green threads had been, but they were gone now, replaced by scars that glowed faintly in the sunlight. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I felt like a different person. My body was exhausted, my mind foggy, but I was alive. Somehow I had survived. The hunger bloom was weakened, at least for now. But I knew deep down that it wasn't gone. Something like that doesn't just disappear. Joseph was waiting for me on the porch, his expression grim but relieved when he saw me. "You did it," he said quietly, though his tone carried more caution than celebration. I nodded, too tired to say much. "Its set's hurt," I managed to say, "but its set's not dead." He didn't seem surprised. "It never really dies," he said. "It just sleeps until the conditions are right again." I showed him my arm, where the scars glowed faintly under the sunlight like tiny veins of green light. Joseph studied them with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Your scepter connected to it now," he said. "Not fully, but enough to sense it." I didn't know what that meant, or how I felt about it. All I knew was that I couldn't let this thing spread again, not here, not anywhere. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Joseph and the other rangers to create a containment protocol disguised as invasive species management. We marked certain areas of the park as research exclusion zones and came up with elaborate cover stories to keep tourists away. Joseph helped us map the bloom cycles based on indigenous knowledge, and we started monitoring the wetlands more closely than ever before. I also began training other rangers on how to recognize biological anomalies, subtle signs that something wasn't right in the ecosystem. It wasn't easy convincing them at first. Most thought I was overreacting or chasing ghosts. But after showing them my scars and the photos I'd taken in the clearing, they started to take me seriously. My blood samples became the basis for new medical research into symbiotic treatments, ways to use plant-based organisms to heal rather than harm. It felt strange knowing that something so deadly could also hold the potential for life-saving discoveries. But even with all our precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only delaying the inevitable. Every time I visited one of the exclusion zones, I saw subtle signs of regrowth, tiny patches of vegetation that looked too glossy, too alive. One evening, as I walked through one of those areas alone, I felt a faint tug in my mind, a whisper from something deep underground. It wasn't threatening or angry, it was just there watching, waiting. I stopped and stared at the plants around me, their leaves swaying gently in the breeze like nothing had ever happened. For a moment, I wondered if they were aware of me, if they remembered what I had done. I took a deep breath and turned away, heading back toward my truck as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Everglades looked peaceful again under the fading light, but I knew better now. Nature isn't set always kind. My name is Elijah Winters. I'm a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. I've been walking these trails for over 20 years, and before that I grew up in these mountains. This land is in my blood, every tree, every rock, every twist and turn of the trails. My family lived here for generations before we were forced out when they turned the area into a national park back in the 1930s. I took this job to protect the land that was once ours, but I'll admit, there's more to it than that. These mountains hold stories, some you'd never believe unless you've seen them yourself. And me, I've seen things I wish I hadn't. It was the summer of 1967, during what folks called the Summer of Love. People were flocking to nature to escape the chaos of the world, Vietnam War protests, civil rights struggles, all of it. The park was busier than usual with hikers and backpackers looking for peace. But that summer wasn't peaceful. Not for me. The first sign that something was wrong came with the fog. Now, fog isn't unusual in these mountains, but this was different. It would roll in thick and heavy, even on warm, sunny days when there was no reason for it. It didn't move like normal fog either. It clung to certain parts of the trail like it had a mind of its own. One morning, I was out on my routine trail check. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze, a typical summer day in Shenandoah. But as I climbed higher into the hills, the air changed. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I saw it, a trail marker that had been moved. It wasn't where it should have been, and I knew these trails like the back of my hand. Someone or something had shifted it overnight. At first I thought maybe a hiker had done it by mistake or as a prank, but deep down it didn't feel right. I pulled out my grandfather's old compass, a beautiful thing he carved by hand, and checked my bearings. That's when I noticed something strange. The needle wasn't pointing north anymore. It spun slowly in circles, like it couldn't decide which way to go. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that spinning needle and listening to the silence around me. The fog began creeping in again, swallowing up the trees ahead until they looked like shadows in a dream. Something about that moment sent a chill down my spine, a feeling I hadn't had since Vietnam when danger was close but unseen. I shook it off and told myself it was just bad weather or maybe a faulty compass. But deep down I knew better. The next day started out like any other. I was back on the trail checking markers and clearing debris. It was a warm summer morning, the kind that made you feel lucky to be alive. The fog from the day before had lifted, and everything seemed normal again. But that feeling didn't last long. Around noon, I ran into a group of backpackers, young folks, probably in their early 20s. They were dressed like hippies, with colorful shirts and beads hanging around their necks. They told me they were heading deeper into the park to camp for a few nights. I warned them about staying on the marked trails and keeping an eye on the weather. They laughed it off, saying they'd hiked all over the country and knew what they were doing. I watched them walk away, their laughter fading into the trees. Something about them stuck with me, not because they were careless, but because I had this nagging feeling in my gut that I couldn't shake. It wasn't the first time I'd felt that way out here, but it was stronger than usual. The next morning, I got a call from the ranger station. The hippie group hadn't checked in like they were supposed to. Their friends back at the parking lot were worried. They said they should have been back by now. I grabbed my gear and headed out to search for them. The trails were quiet as I walked, but not in a peaceful way. It was that same unnatural silence I'd felt before, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. After hours of searching, I found their campsite deep in the woods. Their tents were still set up, and their gear was scattered around like they'd just stepped away for a moment. There was even a pot of stew sitting on the campfire ring, half cooked and cold. But there were no people. I called out for them, my voice echoing through the trees. "Hello? Anyone here?" No answer. Just silence. That's when I noticed something strange near the edge of their campsite, footprints in the dirt. At first glance, they looked normal, like someone had walked away from camp. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. The footprints were facing backward. It was like whoever made them had been walking forward, but somehow left prints pointing the other way. I followed them for a while, hoping they'd lead me to the missing hikers, but they didn't make sense. They circled back toward the camp and then disappeared entirely into the underbrush. I stood there staring at those impossible prints for what felt like forever. My grandfather used to tell stories about things like this, about people who got lost in these mountains and never came back because something was leading them astray. I didn't believe him back then, but now I wasn't so sure. I marked the spot on my map and headed back to report what I'd found. As I walked away from that empty campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from the fog creeping through the trees. After reporting the missing hikers, I couldn't get their campsite or those footprints out of my head. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I'd seen plenty of people get lost in these woods over the years, but this was different. It wasn't just bad luck or poor navigation, it felt wrong. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I started by asking around town, talking to some of the older folks who'd lived here before the park was established. Most of them didn't trust the government or the rangers, but they knew me well enough to share a few stories. I sat down with Mrs. Hensley, an 82-year-old woman who used to live in one of the mountain communities that were displaced in the 1930s. Her memory was sharp as a knife, and she didn't hold back. "You ever heard of Ranger Crawford?" she asked, her voice low like she didn't want anyone else to hear. I shook my head. "No, Mostum." She leaned closer, her wrinkled hands gripping her teacup tightly. "He was one of the first rangers here when they kicked us off our land. Mean man, that Crawford. Didn't care about us or our homes. Just did what he was told. Folks said he got lost one night while patrolling the trails during a storm. Never found his way back." I frowned. "What happened to him?" Mrs. Hensley Sipp's eyes narrowed, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Some say he died out there in the fog, but others say he didn't die at all. They say he stayed in those woods, angry and twisted up inside from what he sipped done to us." She paused for a long moment before adding, "My daddy used to call him Set, the man who walks backward. Set said you could tell he was near if your compass stopped working or you saw footprints facing the wrong way." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The footprints at the campsite, the spinning compass, it all lined up too well. I thanked Mrs. Hensley and left her house feeling uneasy. If what she said was true, then Ranger Crawford wasn't just some old ghost story, he was real. That night, I went through old park records at the ranger station, looking for anything about Crawford or strange disappearances over the years. What I found sent chills down my spine. Every 7 years, hikers had gone missing in the same section of trails where I'd found those footprints. The reports were always similar: fog rolling in unexpectedly, compasses failing, and groups getting separated even though they swore they stayed together. I flipped through pages of maps and notes until I noticed something else. All the disappearances formed a pattern, a spiral shape that centered on one specific area deep in the woods. It was the same spot where I'd found those backward footprints. The fog rolled in again the next morning, thicker than I'd ever seen. It clung to the trees like a living thing, wrapping around branches and swallowing the trail ahead. I was heading toward the spot marked on my map, the center of the spiral where all those disappearances seemed to lead. I didn't want to go alone, but there wasn't anyone else to ask. Most of the other rangers were busy with routine patrols, and I wasn't about to explain what I'd found, not yet. They'd think I was crazy. As I walked deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, even though it was midsummer. My breath came out in little clouds, and the silence was back, the kind that made everything feel wrong. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail. I checked my compass again, hoping it would steady itself this time, but no luck. The needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on north. The trail markers started to look strange too. Some were missing entirely, while others had been moved to places that didn't make sense, like they were trying to lead me somewhere I didn't want to go. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow in the fog, a tall figure standing perfectly still between two trees. But as I got closer, it didn't disappear like shadows usually do. It stayed there, unmoving but watching me. I froze in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The figure stepped forward slowly, its movements unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. It was wearing an old ranger uniform, but it was torn and faded with age. The hat sat crooked on its head, and its limbs bent backward at the joints as it walked toward me. Its face, I can barely describe it, pale and gaunt with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the fog. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the forest itself was holding me in place. The figure stopped a few yards away and tilted its head, slowly and possibly, until its neck twisted all the way around. Then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with voices, familiar ones. My grandfather's voice came first, soft and calm like he used to sound when telling me bedtime stories as a kid. "Elijah," it said in his tone, "you shouldn't be here." Then came another voice, a young woman's voice I didn't recognize but knew instinctively belonged to one of the missing hikers. "Help us," she whispered through the fog. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from whatever had been holding me still. The figure didn't follow, it just stood there watching as I turned and ran blindly down the trail. But no matter how far I ran or how fast, I kept seeing the same tree over and over, a lightning-struck oak with twisted branches that looked like claws reaching for the sky. It didn't make sense. I should have been miles away by now, but somehow I kept ending up back at that same spot. I don't know how long I kept walking, but it felt like hours. Every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into the fog, and no matter which direction I turned, I kept ending up back at that same lightning-struck oak tree. It was impossible, like the forest itself was playing tricks on me. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. My legs were shaking, and my heart felt like it was about to pound out of my chest. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps. They weren't mine. At first, they were faint, like someone was walking far behind me, but then they got louder, closer, until it sounded like whoever or whatever it was just a few feet away. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the fog, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best effort to stay calm. "Is someone there?" No answer, just silence. Then the footsteps started again, this time circling around me. They weren't fast or hurried. They were slow and deliberate, like whoever was making them wanted me to know they were there. I gripped my flashlight tighter and started walking again, faster this time. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew better than to panic in the woods. Running would only make things worse. As I moved forward, the fog seemed to thicken around me, swallowing up the trail ahead. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every breath I took felt harder than the last. That's when I saw it, a clearing up ahead. For a moment, relief washed over me. Maybe I'd finally found a way out of this nightmare. But as I stepped into the clearing, my stomach dropped. The ground was littered with bones, human bones arranged in a spiral pattern that stretched across the entire space. Skulls stared up at me from the dirt, their empty eye sockets seeming to follow me as I moved. In the center of the spiral was something even worse. A pile of belongings, backpacks, boots, torn clothing, all covered in dirt and moss like they'd been there for years. I recognized one of the backpacks immediately. It belonged to one of the missing hikers. My hands shook as I reached for my radio to call for help, but when I pressed the button, all I got was static. The signal was dead. Then I heard it again. The footsteps, but this time they weren't behind me. They were coming from all around me. I turned in circles, trying to figure out where they were coming from, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. My flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. And that's when I saw him. The crooked man stepped out of the fog like he'd been waiting for me all along. His impossibly tall frame loomed over the clearing, his backward-bending limbs moving with an unnatural grace as he walked toward me. His head twisted slowly around until it faced me directly, those glowing hollow eyes locking onto mine. I froze in place as he raised one long arm and pointed at the spiral of bones on the ground. It wasn't just a trap, it was a warning. I stood there frozen, staring at the crooked man as he pointed toward the spiral of bones. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like the air around me had turned solid, trapping me in place. The fog thickened even more, swallowing up the edges of the clearing until it felt like I was the only person left in the world. The crooked man tilted his head again, slowly, unnaturally, and then he started walking toward me. His footsteps didn't make a sound anymore. He moved like a shadow, gliding over the ground without disturbing the dirt or leaves beneath him. The closer he got, the colder the air became. My breath came out in shaky clouds, and I could feel my heartbeat slowing down, like he was draining the life out of me just by being near. I don't know what made me remember it. Maybe it was desperation or some deep instinct, but my grandfather's voice came back to me in that moment. I could hear him singing one of those old Appalachian folk songs he used to hum while carving wood on the porch. "Keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the sky." The words echoed in my head, and suddenly I knew what I had to do. I opened my mouth and started singing, not well, not loudly, but enough to break through the silence that surrounded me. "Keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the sky." The crooked man stopped in his tracks. His head twisted sharply toward me, and for a moment I thought he was going to lunge forward, but instead he stumbled just slightly, like he'd been caught off guard. I kept singing, louder this time. My voice cracked and wavered, but I didn't stop. "Keep your feet on the ground and your eyes on the sky." The fog around me started to shift, swirling like it was being pulled away by some unseen force. The crooked man's movements grew jerky and uneven, his limbs twitching as if he was trying to fight against whatever was happening. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter, the one I always carried for emergencies, and flicked it on. The tiny flame felt like a lifeline in that moment, a reminder that I wasn't completely powerless. I grabbed a handful of dry leaves from the ground and set them alight. The fire spread quickly, crackling and snapping as it climbed up a nearby bush. The heat pushed back against the cold air around me, and for the first time in hours, or maybe days, I felt like I could breathe again. The crooked man let out a sound, a horrible, guttural noise that didn't belong to anything human. He staggered backward as the fire grew brighter, his glowing eyes flickering like dying embers. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran as fast as I could, tearing through the fog and back onto the trail. Behind me, I could hear the crackling of flames mixed with that awful sound, the sound of something angry and defeated. Eventually, I reached a stream, a narrow ribbon of running water cutting through the forest. Without thinking twice, I splashed across it, soaking my boots, but putting distance between myself and whatever was behind me. The fog didn't follow me across the water. It stayed on the other side of the stream, swirling angrily but unable to cross. I kept running until I saw sunlight breaking through the trees ahead, a sight that felt like pure salvation after everything I'd been through. I don't remember much about how I made it back to the ranger station. My legs felt like they were moving on autopilot, carrying me away from the woods and towards safety. When I finally stumbled inside, the other rangers looked at me like I'd seen a ghost, and maybe I had. I told them about the missing hikers and the fire. I'd started to signal for help. I didn't mention the crooked man or the spiral of bones. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. The official report blamed the fire on a lightning strike, and when search teams went out to investigate, they found the hikers' remains scattered in the woods. The authorities called it a tragic accident, a case of inexperienced campers getting lost and succumbing to the elements. But I knew better. After that summer, something changed in me. I couldn't trust my instincts anymore. Not after what happened out there. My compass never worked right again, and even with maps and GPS, I struggled to navigate trails I'd known my whole life. It was like the land itself had turned against me. I tried to warn people, other rangers, hikers, anyone who would listen, but most of them just laughed it off as superstition. Still, a few locals took me seriously. They started passing down rules for hiking in Shenandoah. Never hike in fog, always carry running water, and sing if you feel lost. Every 7th summer, strange things keep happening. Equipment failures, trail markers disappearing overnight, and hikers reporting disorientation, even on well-marked paths. The Park Service rerouted some trails after that summer, but they never gave an official reason why. As for me, I stayed on as a ranger for a few more years before retiring early. The mountains were my home once, But after that summer, they felt like a stranger, a place I couldn't trust anymore. Sometimes I still hear my grandfather's voice in my dreams, singing that old folk song. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and heavy outside my window, I wonder if he was trying to warn me all along. The crooked man is still out there. I'm sure of it. He's waiting for his next victim, twisting trails and bending time until they're hopelessly lost. And if you ever find yourself hiking in Shenandoah National Park and see footprints facing the wrong way, turn around. Don't follow them. Because once he finds you, there's no way out. My name is Vincent Holloway. I'm a ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky, home to the longest cave system in the world. It's beautiful, sure, but it's also a place that can swallow you whole if you're not careful. I've spent years down here mapping tunnels, studying formations, and making sure tourists don't wander off and get themselves lost. But no matter how familiar I've gotten with these caves, there's always been something about them that feels off, like they're alive somehow. Watching. Waiting. It was the fall of 1972 when everything changed. The air was different that season, heavier, like it was being pulled into the earth itself. Scientists said it had something to do with barometric pressure fluctuations, but I wasn't so sure. The caves felt restless, like they were hiding a secret too big to keep buried. I'd been assigned to lead a small team into an unexplored section of the cave system. It was supposed to be routine, just another day of mapping and documenting, but from the moment we stepped into that untouched darkness, I knew we didn't belong there. The air was colder than it should have been, and every sound seemed to echo forever, like the cave was trying to memorize us. There were 5 of us on the team. Me, 2 junior rangers fresh out of training, a geologist named Dr. Elaine Carter, and a volunteer spelunker named Tom, who'd been exploring caves longer than I'd been alive. We were equipped with the best gear NASA could provide, sonar mapping devices, night vision cameras, and enough supplies to last us a week underground. But none of that could prepare us for what we were about to find. As we moved deeper into the cave, the tourist-friendly pathways gave way to untouched chambers filled with ancient formations that hadn't seen light in thousands of years. The walls sparkled with minerals, and the floor was littered with strange patterns of rocks that looked almost deliberate, like someone or something had arranged them. At first, we chalked it up to natural formations, or maybe even an old Native American site. But then we found the bodies. They weren't fresh, not by a long shot, but they were perfectly preserved. Skin stretched tight over bones, clothes still intact despite the centuries, and their eyes were missing. Every single one of them. We should have turned back right then and there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out while we still could, but curiosity is a dangerous thing, and we pressed on. We kept moving deeper into the cave, but something didn't feel right. The air was getting colder, and it felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us. Every step we took seemed louder than it should have been, the echoes bouncing back at us from directions that didn't make sense. It was like the cave was playing tricks on us. Tom, the volunteer spelunker, was leading the way when he stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" he asked, shining his flashlight into the darkness ahead. We all froze, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, but then there it was, a faint sound like a whisper carried on the wind. But we were miles underground. There shouldn't have been any wind. Probably just the air moving through the tunnels, Dr. Carter said, trying to sound calm, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She wasn't buying her own explanation. We reached a chamber that was bigger than anything I'd ever seen before. The ceiling stretched so high that our flashlights couldn't reach it, and the walls were covered in strange claw-like marks. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate, almost like writing, but no one could figure out what they meant. "Look at this," one of the junior rangers, Mike, said as he pointed to the ground. There were more bodies, older this time, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from centuries ago. They were arranged in a circle, their hands stretched toward the center as if they had been reaching for something. I bent down to get a closer look and noticed something strange about their skin. It wasn't decayed like you'd expect. It was thin and translucent, almost like paper. I could see faint shadows beneath it, shapes that didn't look human. What could have done this? Mike asked quietly. I didn't instead have an answer for him. None of us did. As we moved further into the chamber, I noticed something else. There were no signs of animals anywhere. No bats, no insects, nothing alive except us. That's when I started to feel it. The sensation of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. I could feel eyes on me even though there was nothing there. And then it happened. One of the junior rangers, Sarah, wandered off to check out a narrow passage on her own. We called out to her when we realized she wasn't with us anymore, but she didn't respond. I felt panic rising in my chest as we searched for her in the darkness. Finally, she came back, but something was wrong. She looked pale and distant, like she wasn't fully there. Where did you go? I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know, she said softly. I think I heard someone calling me. Calling you? Dr. Carter asked sharply. Sarah nodded, but wouldn't say anything else. Sarah's strange behavior put everyone on edge. She kept rubbing her arms like she was cold, even though the rest of us felt fine. Her eyes darted around the cave like she was looking for something or someone that wasn't there. I wanted to ask her more, but something told me it wasn't the right time. We needed to stay focused. Dr. Carter suggested we take a break to regroup, so we set up a small camp in one of the larger chambers. As we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The cave was too quiet. Normally you'd hear the faint sound of dripping water or the rustle of bats in the distance, but here nothing, just silence. While the others rested, I pulled out my prototype sonar mapping device and started scanning the area. The device was supposed to create a 3D map of the cave using sound waves, but when I looked at the screen, I saw something that didn't make sense. There were tunnels showing up on the map that shouldn't have been there, tunnels that seemed to twist and overlap in impossible ways. What's wrong? Tom asked, noticing my expression. I showed him the screen. These readings don't make sense, I said. It states like the cave is changing. Tom frowned, but didn't say anything. Dr. Carter joined us and took a look at the map. Maybe it's a glitch, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. As we talked, Sarah suddenly stood up and started walking toward one of the dark passages without saying a word. Sarah. I called out, rushing after her. Where are you going? She stopped and turned to look at me, her face pale and blank. I think they're waiting for us, she said softly. Who's waiting? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. She didn't answer. We decided to stick together from that point on. No more wandering off alone, but the damage had already been done. The tension in the group was palpable, and every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should have. Later that night, or what we thought was night, it's hard to tell time underground. I found an old journal tucked into a crack in one of the walls. The pages were brittle with age, but I could still make out some of the writing. It was dated 1786 and described an expedition into Mammoth Cave led by a man named Silas Whitaker. The journal talked about strange sounds and claw marks in the rock. Just like what we seen, it mentioned people disappearing without a trace and whispers coming from deep within the earth. The last entry sent chills down my spine. They are not human anymore. I showed the journal to Dr. Carter, who read it silently before handing it back to me with trembling hands. We need to leave, she said firmly. But it was already too late. We packed up quickly after Dr. Carter said we should leave. No one argued. Even Tom, who was usually the bravest of us, looked shaken. But as we started heading back toward the main tunnels, the cave seemed different. Passages we just walked through hours ago were narrower now, almost like the walls had shifted. The air felt wrong too, thicker, harder to breathe. And that whispering sound we'd heard earlier, it was louder now. It wasn't coming from one direction anymore. It was all around us, echoing off the walls like it was alive. Keep moving, I said, trying to sound confident for the team's sake. But inside, I was terrified. We hadn't gone far when Sarah stopped again. She was staring at something in the distance, her flashlight pointed at a cluster of stalagmites. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then one of the stalagmites moved. It was instead a rock. It was something alive. "Run," I shouted, pulling Sarah back as the thing began to unfold itself. Its skin was thin and pale, almost translucent, and its long fingers scraped against the ground as it stood up. It didn't have eyes, just smooth skin where its face should have been, but it turned toward us like it could see anyway. The others froze in place, too shocked to move. "Go," I yelled again, shoving them forward. We ran blindly through the tunnels, our flashlights bouncing off the walls as we tried to find our way out. But they were everywhere. More of them emerged from the shadows, creatures that had been perfectly still moments ago, blending into the rock formations like they were part of the cave itself. They moved silently, except for a faint clicking sound that echoed in the air. Their oversized ears twitched as if they were listening to us. One of them reached for Tom with its long fingers, but he swung his flashlight at it and managed to knock it back. "Keep moving," he shouted. We stumbled into a smaller chamber and blocked the entrance with rocks as best we could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. "What are those things?" Mike asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, "but they said not human." Dr. Carter was staring at her sonar equipment, her face pale. "They sip everywhere," she whispered. "They sip in the walls." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. The creatures weren't just living in the caves, they were the caves. As we tried to catch our breath, Sarah started mumbling to herself again. "They sipped are hungry," she said softly. "They need us." "What are you talking about?" I asked her. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "They want what sips inside us." Before I could ask what she meant, we heard movement outside, the faint sound of claws scraping against stone. They were coming for us. The scraping sounds grew louder, closer. It was like they were testing the rocks we'd piled up, figuring out how to get through. I could feel the panic rising in the group, but I knew if we lost control, we wouldn't make it out alive. "We need to move," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If we stay here, they'll trap us." "But where do we go?" Mike asked, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "They star everywhere." I didn't have an answer. The sonar map was useless now. It showed tunnels that didn't exist and blank spaces where passages should have been. It was like the cave itself was working against us. Then Dr. Carter spoke up. "Sound," she said suddenly. "They stir using sound to communicate, or to hunt us." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pointed to her equipment. "The clicking noises, they stir subsonic frequencies, they stir messing with our heads, making us disoriented." I remembered the strange whispers we'd been hearing, and the way Sarah had wandered off earlier. It made sense. The creatures weren't just hunting us, they were playing with us. "Can we stop it?" Tom asked. Dr. Carter hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Maybe, if we can create a sound barrier, something loud enough to disrupt their frequencies, it might keep them away." I thought about the NASA equipment we brought with us, including a portable sound generator designed for testing cave acoustics. It wasn't meant for defense, but it was our best shot. "Let's do it," I said. We grabbed a generator from our gear and set it up in the center of the chamber. Dr. Carter adjusted the settings while Tom and I kept watch at the entrance, our flashlights trained on the darkness outside. The clicking sound stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then one of the creatures appeared in the doorway, its elongated fingers reaching for us. "Now," I shouted. Dr. Carter flipped the switch, and a high-pitched sound blasted through the chamber. It was so loud that I had to cover my ears, but it worked. The creature recoiled instantly, its thin skin rippling like it was in pain. More of them appeared behind it, but they couldn't get any closer. The sound was keeping them at bay for now. "We need to move," Dr. Carter said urgently. "This one set hold them forever." We grabbed our gear and ran deeper into the cave, following a narrow passage that seemed to slope upward. If we could just find an exit or even a safe place to hide, we might stand a chance. But then we found it. The passage opened into a massive chamber filled with hundreds of bodies, people frozen in place like statues, their skin pale and translucent like the creatures. Some of them were still alive, their eyes darting around in terror as their mouths moved silently. "They're harvesting them," Dr. Carter whispered. I felt sick to my stomach as I realized what she meant. The creatures weren't just killing people, they were keeping them alive for some kind of process. And whatever they were doing, it wasn't natural. "We have to stop this," I said firmly. Tom looked at me like I was crazy. "How?" "There's too many of them." I didn't know yet, but I wasn't about to let those things win. The sight of those bodies, hundreds of them frozen in place like they were stuck between life and death, was burned into my mind. I couldn't look away, even though every instinct in me screamed to run. These creatures weren't just predators, they were something worse, something unnatural. Dr. Carter was scanning the room with her sonar equipment, her hands shaking as she adjusted the settings. "This chamber," she said quietly, "it seps their hive. This is where they bring people to harvest them." "Harvest them for what?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. She didn't set to answer right away. Finally, she said, "The pineal gland. It seps part of the brain, controls sleep, consciousness, things we don't fully understand yet. They are extracting it." I felt a chill run down my spine. It explained the missing eyes. The creatures were targeting the area behind them. But why? What could they possibly need from us? As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Sarah suddenly spoke up. "They spur not monsters," she said softly. "They spur just evolving." Her words startled me. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She turned to look at me, her face pale and calm in a way that didn't feel right. "They were human once," she said. "A long time ago, but the cave changed them." "How do you know that?" Tom demanded. Sarah didn't answer, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't fully herself anymore. Before I could say anything else, Dr. Carter's equipment picked up movement behind us. The creatures were coming again, crawling through the walls like shadows stretching out of the rock. "We need to destroy this place," I said urgently. "If we don't they keep taking people." Dr. Carter hesitated. "Destroying it might not stop them," she said quietly. "They adapted to survive down here. They will just rebuild." "Then we make sure they can't," I said firmly. We worked quickly to rig the sound generator to the cave's natural acoustics, using the rock formations to amplify the frequencies as much as possible. It was risky. If the sound was too strong, it could cause a cave-in, but it was our only chance. As we finished setting up, Sarah stepped forward again, her movements slow and deliberate. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "What are you talking about?" I asked her. "They are not evil," she said. "They are just trying to survive." I realized then what had happened. Sarah had been affected by them somehow. Maybe it was the subsonic frequencies or something else entirely, but she wasn't on our side anymore. Before anyone could stop her, she reached for the generator and tried to shut it off. Tom grabbed her and pulled her back while Dr. Carter activated the device. A deafening sound filled the chamber, shaking the walls and sending the creatures into a frenzy. They writhed and screeched as their thin skin rippled under the pressure of the sound waves. But then the ground started to tremble. "It's working," Dr. Carter shouted over the noise. "No," I said grimly, as I looked around at the cracking walls and falling debris. "It's collapsing." The creatures began retreating into the shadows as rocks fell from above, but we weren't safe yet. We ran for the nearest passageway as fast as we could, dodging falling stones and trying not to trip over uneven ground. As we reached a narrow tunnel leading upward, I stopped and turned back toward the hive chamber one last time. The generator was still running, its sound echoing through every corner of the cave system. I knew what I had to do. "Go," I shouted at Tom and Dr. Carter as they hesitated near the entrance. "What about you?" Tom asked urgently. "I said I'll hold them off," I said firmly. "Just go." Reluctantly, they ran ahead while I stayed behind to make sure the creatures didn't follow them or anyone else ever again. I don't remember much about what happened after I stayed behind. The sound from the generator was deafening, shaking the walls and forcing the creatures deeper into the hive. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I could feel the cave collapsing around me. I thought it was the end, that I'd be buried down there with those things. But somehow I survived. When I woke up, I was lying near the entrance of the cave system, covered in dust and bruises. Tom and Dr. Carter had managed to pull me out before everything came crashing down. The hive chamber was gone, sealed beneath tons of rock and the creatures with it. At least, that's what we hoped. The park officials closed off that section of Mammoth Cave permanently, claiming it was due to geological instability. They didn't want anyone asking questions about what we'd found down there. The government got involved too, men in suits who didn't give their names, and they took all our equipment, including the sonar maps and Dr. Carter's research notes. They told us to keep quiet, that no one would believe us anyway. But I couldn't forget. Even now, years later, I still feel the effects of what happened in that cave. My hearing isn't the same anymore. It's sharper somehow, like I can pick up sounds other people can't. Sometimes when the barometric pressure drops, I get this ringing in my ears, followed by a faint clicking sound that makes my skin crawl. I know they stir still down there. I've spent the years since training other rangers to recognize the signs, strange echoes, claw marks in the rock, missing tourists who seem to vanish without a trace. Most of them think I'm crazy, but some listen, some understand. Dr. Carter disappeared a few years after the incident. She told me she was going to keep researching what we found in Mammoth Cave, the creatures, their connection to humans, but then she just vanished. No one knows where she went. Tom retired, not long after that. He said he couldn't go into caves anymore, not after what he saw. I don't blame him. As for Sarah, she didn't set naked out of the cave alive, but sometimes, when I sip alone in the dark, I swear I can hear her voice whispering to me, "They sip are not evil, they sip are just trying to survive." I try not to think about it too much. The caves are sealed now, but that doesn't mean we're safe. Mammoth Cave is just one part of a much larger system, a network of tunnels that stretches across the country and maybe even farther than that. If those creatures survived, and I think they did, they'll find another way out eventually. And when they do, we still be waiting. My name is Richard Harlow. I'm a park ranger in the Adirondack Mountains, New York. I came here looking for peace, hoping the quiet of the forest would help me escape the noise in my head, the memories of war, the shouting, the explosions. But sometimes, the quiet can be worse. Sometimes it feels like the silence is alive, watching you, waiting. It was the summer of 1961, but it didn't feel like summer at all. The air was cold, colder than it should have been, and there was this strange fog that hung low over the trees. It wasn't like normal fog. It seemed to move against the wind, curling around trunks and creeping along the ground like it had a mind of its own. The animals in the forest were acting strange too. Birds weren't singing. Squirrels weren't darting around like they usually do. It was like everything was holding its breath. I remember that morning clearly. I was out on patrol, walking along one of my favorite trails. The sun was peeking through the trees, casting golden light on the forest floor. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. The air was too still, and every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. I stopped by a stream to refill my canteen and noticed something odd. The water was colder than ice. My breath fogged up as if it were winter instead of summer. I looked around but didn't see anything unusual at first. Then I noticed a patch of frost on a fallen log nearby. Frost in July? That's when I felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and fog. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I continued my patrol, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that maybe I was just imagining things because of how quiet everything was. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Later that day, I got a call on my radio about a missing family, a couple and their 2 kids who had been camping near one of the more remote trails. Their campsite had been found abandoned with food still cooking over their fire pit and their belongings scattered around like they'd left in a hurry. I didn't know it then, but that call would change everything. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was eerily quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The family's tent was still standing, but it looked like someone had torn through their supplies in a hurry. A pot of stew sat over the fire pit, untouched, now cold and congealed. Plates were scattered on the ground, some with food still on them. It was as if they'd been in the middle of dinner and just vanished. I crouched down near the fire pit and noticed something strange. There were footprints leading away from the campsite, but they didn't make any sense. They started right next to the tent. No sign of anyone walking up to it, and they weren't normal footprints either. They were long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the toes. I'd never seen anything like it before. I followed the tracks for a short distance, but they stopped abruptly in the middle of a clearing, just gone, like whoever or whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed how cold it had gotten. My breath was visible in the air, even though it was supposed to be summer. I radioed back to the station to report what I'd found, but my signal kept cutting out with static. I could barely get a word through before the line went dead completely. Frustrated, I decided to head back to my truck and drive to a spot with better reception. As I walked back toward the campsite, something caught my eye, a flash of movement in the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to notice, but I swear I saw something tall and pale dart between the trunks. My heart started pounding as I scanned the forest around me, but whatever it was had disappeared. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light, but deep down I knew better. When I got back to my truck, I found frost on the windshield, thick enough that I had to scrape it off with my knife before I could see through it. That didn't make any sense. It hadn't been cold enough for frost when I parked there earlier. By the time I made it back to the ranger station and reported what I'd seen, night had fallen. The search teams were already being organized to look for the missing family first thing in the morning, but something told me we wouldn't find them. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had taken that family was still out there watching. The next morning, the search team set out early. They joined one of the groups heading toward the deeper parts of the forest, where the terrain was rough and the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt colder than the day before, and the fog was thicker now, clinging to everything like a wet blanket. We combed through the area near the family's campsite for hours, but found nothing. No signs of struggle, no trails leading anywhere. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. The other rangers tried to stay optimistic, but I could tell they were uneasy too. Something about this didn't feel right. Around noon, we split up into smaller groups to cover more ground. I paired up with a young volunteer named Mark. He was new to the job, barely out of college, and still had that wide-eyed enthusiasm that made me feel protective of him. As we hiked deeper into the forest, I noticed how quiet it had gotten again. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of our boots crunching through leaves. Then we found it. Mark spotted it first, a shape hanging from a tree about 20 yards ahead. As we got closer, my stomach turned. It was one of our park volunteers, a woman named Sarah, who had been helping with trail maintenance earlier in the week. She was suspended high in the branches, her body twisted unnaturally, her clothes torn and bloodied. But she wasn't set dead. Her head turned slowly toward us as we approached, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "It's Seps here," she said. "It's Seps watching." Mark froze in place, his face pale as a sheet. I climbed up as quickly as I could to get her down, but her injuries were severe, deep gashes across her torso and arms, like she'd been attacked by something with claws. She kept mumbling incoherently about voices and shadows before finally passing out. We radioed for help and stayed with her until another team arrived to take her back to the station for medical attention. But even after she was gone, I couldn't shake her words, "It's Seps here, it's Seps watching." As Mark and I continued our search later that afternoon, I started hearing things, soft whispers coming from somewhere in the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it clearly, my brother's voice. "Richie," he called out, using the nickname he always used when we were kids. "Richie, Help me." I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. My brother had died years ago during the war. I knew that. But his voice sounded so real, so close. Mark asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't answer him. All I could do was stare into the foggy woods ahead of us. "Richie," the voice called again, softer this time. I took a step forward without even thinking about it, drawn toward the sound like it had some invisible pull on me. But then Mark grabbed my arm and snapped me out of it. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice shaking. I looked at him and shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. "Nothing," I said quickly. "Let's keep moving." But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Not with me, and not with this forest. Later that evening, after we returned to the station empty-handed again, I started piecing things together. The frost on the windshield, Sarah's warnings, my brother's voice, none of it made sense, unless you stopped thinking logically and started considering something else, something darker. I remembered hearing stories from local indigenous communities about creatures that stalked these woods long before settlers arrived, things that mimicked voices and preyed on fear. Wendigos. That word popped into my head like an unwelcome guest. I didn't want to believe it, not yet. But every instinct told me this wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah hanging in that tree, her broken body whispering warnings, and I heard my brother's voice again, calling to me from the fog. It was like the forest itself had followed me home, invading my mind. I decided to do some digging. The ranger station had an old archive room filled with dusty files and handwritten reports from decades ago. Most of it was boring stuff, trail maps, wildlife surveys, but I was looking for something specific, anything about disappearances in the area. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Every 20 years, like clockwork, people went missing in these woods. Campers, hikers, even rangers, whole groups sometimes, vanished without a trace. The reports were vague, chalking it up to accidents or wild animal attacks, but there were details that didn't add up. Frost in the middle of summer, footprints that led nowhere, whispered voices that survivors claimed to hear before they disappeared. One file stood out, a report from 1941 about a military experiment conducted in the area during World War II. The government had used the forest for sound-based research, trying to amplify and manipulate frequencies for communication purposes. According to the file, strange things started happening during the experiments: equipment malfunctioning, soldiers reporting hallucinations, and unexplained disappearances among the staff. The experiments were shut down after only a few months, but the locals believed something had been disturbed, something ancient that should have been left alone. I dug deeper into local folklore and found stories about a creature called the Wendigo. The Algonquin people described it as a spirit of hunger and greed that could possess humans who resorted to cannibalism during harsh winters. But it wasn't just a legend, it was something real, something alive in these woods. The Wendigo was said to mimic voices to lure its prey and freeze entire areas with its presence. It thrived on fear and despair, stalking its victims for days before finally feeding on them. But it wasn't invincible. It feared fire and certain sacred herbs used by indigenous healers. I sat back in my chair, staring at the files spread across the desk. My gut told me this was what we were dealing with. The thing that had taken Sarah and the family, and if we didn't act fast, it would take more people. I wanted to warn the others, but how could I explain this? How could I convince them that we weren't dealing with a bear or some escaped convict, but something far worse, something unnatural? I decided I'd have to handle this myself. If no one else believed me, then I'd go after it alone. The next morning, I decided to act. I couldn't sit around waiting for someone else to figure out what was happening. Mark volunteered to join me again, but I hesitated. He was too young, too green for something like this. Still, he insisted, and I didn't have the heart to turn him away. We headed toward the cave systems on the far side of the park. The area was remote and dangerous, sharp rocks, narrow passages, but it was one of the few places we hadn't searched yet. As we walked, the fog seemed thicker than ever, curling around our legs and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Mark was quiet most of the way, but I could tell he was nervous. His hands kept twitching, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected something to jump out at us. I didn't blame him. I felt it too, that heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. We reached the entrance to the caves just before noon. The opening was dark and jagged, like a mouth waiting to swallow us whole. I told Mark to stay close and keep his flashlight steady as we stepped inside. The air inside was freezing, colder than anything I'd felt before, and smelled faintly of rot and wintergreen. The walls were slick with moisture, and our footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow space. Every sound seemed amplified, bouncing back at us in strange ways. We hadn't gone far when we heard it, a voice calling out from deeper in the cave. It sounded like a young boy crying for help. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. I nodded, but didn't say anything. My gut told me it wasn't real, that it was just another trick, but Mark didn't know that. Before I could stop him, he rushed ahead, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he ran toward the sound. "Mark, wait," I shouted, chasing after him. I turned a corner just in time to see him disappear into the shadows. Then there was a scream, high-pitched and full of terror, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the ground. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I forced myself to move forward, gripping my flashlight tightly as I rounded the corner. Mark was gone. All that was left were his flashlight and a smear of blood leading deeper into the cave. I wanted to go after him. I really did, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Whatever had taken him wasn't something I could fight alone. Shaking with fear and guilt, I stumbled out of the cave and radioed for help. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Mark was gone, just like Sarah, just like that family. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's flashlight lying there in the cave, the blood trail leading into the darkness. I should have stopped him. I should have gone after him, but I didn't. And now he was gone. The guilt was eating me alive, but so was something else. Anger. Whatever this thing was, it had taken too many people. It wasn't going to stop unless someone stopped it first, and if no one else was willing to do it, then it had to be me. I spent the next day preparing. I packed a small bag with supplies, a flashlight, matches, kerosene, and a flare gun from the station's emergency kit. I also grabbed some dried sage from an old first aid box. One of the indigenous rangers had left it there years ago, saying it was good for warding off spirits. I didn't know if it would work, but at this point, I'd take any help I could get. By late afternoon, the fog had grown so thick that it felt like walking through a dream. The air was colder than ever, and every sound seemed muffled, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I made my way to an old fire watchtower deep in the woods, a place I knew well from my patrols. It was isolated and high enough to give me a clear view of the surrounding area. If this thing wanted me, it would have to come to me on my terms. As night fell, the forest grew unnaturally silent again. No wind, no animals, just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I climbed up into the watchtower and waited, my flare gun loaded and my bag of supplies close at hand. Hours passed with nothing but darkness and fog surrounding me. Then, just as I started to think maybe it wasn't coming after all, I heard it. "Richie." The voice came from somewhere below the tower, a soft, familiar call that sent shivers down my spine. "Richie, help me." It was my brother's voice again, just like before. But this time I didn't move. I gripped the flare gun tightly and forced myself to stay put. "Richie, why won't you help me?" The voice grew louder, angrier. Then came another sound, the creak of wood as something heavy began climbing up the tower. I pointed my flashlight down through the gaps in the floorboards and saw it for the first time, a tall, emaciated figure with pale skin stretched tight over its bones. Its limbs were impossibly long, bending at unnatural angles as it pulled itself upward with silent precision. Its face, or what should have been its face, was featureless, except for two hollow eyes that seemed to suck in all the light around them. My hands shook as I fumbled for the matches and kerosene in my bag. The creature reached the platform just as I managed to splash kerosene across the wooden floorboards around me. It stopped for a moment, tilting its head like it was studying me. Then it opened its mouth, or what passed for a mouth, and let out a sound that made my ears ring, a horrible mix of screams and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I lit a match and held it up between us. "You don't like fire, do you?" I said, my voice trembling but firm. The creature recoiled slightly at the sight of the flame but didn't retreat entirely. It lunged forward suddenly, swiping at me with one of its clawed hands. I dodged just in time but felt pain explode in my arm as its claws raked across my shoulder. I stumbled back and dropped the match onto the kerosene-soaked floorboards. Flames roared to life instantly, spreading quickly across the platform. The creature let out another unearthly scream as the fire surrounded us both. Desperate and cornered, it lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. Using every ounce of strength I had left, I grabbed my flare gun and fired directly into its chest. The flare hit its mark, igniting the creature in a burst of red light and heat. It thrashed wildly as flames consumed its body, letting out one final scream before collapsing into ash. I barely managed to climb down from the burning tower before it collapsed entirely. My arm was bleeding badly, and every part of me felt like it had been through hell, but I was alive. For now, the fire watchtower burned to the ground that night, taking the creature with it. I barely made it back to the ranger station, stumbling through the fog with my arm wrapped in a torn piece of my shirt to stop the bleeding. The other rangers found me just outside the station, pale and shaking, barely able to speak. They patched me up as best they could and called for an ambulance. I told them what had happened, about the Wendigo, about Mark, about the fire, but none of them believed me. They said I was in shock, that I'd had a psychotic break brought on by stress and trauma. They blamed the fire on faulty equipment and wrote off Mark's disappearance as an accident. The official report said he'd fallen into one of the caves and couldn't be recovered. But I knew the truth. I spent weeks in the hospital recovering from my injuries. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. Mark was gone. Sarah was barely hanging on, and that family, well, no one ever found them. After I was discharged, I tried to go back to work, but it wasn't the same. Every time I stepped into those woods, I felt it. The cold, the silence, the lingering presence of something unnatural. The forest wasn't safe anymore, and I wasn't sure it ever would be again. The indigenous communities around the area seemed to know what had happened, even if they didn't say it outright. A few weeks after the fire, they placed protective totems around the edges of the forest, small carvings made from wood and bone, tied with red string and sage. They didn't explain why, but I didn't need them to. I knew those totems were meant to keep whatever was left of that creature from coming back. But every year after that, on the summer solstice, frost would appear on those totems, thin layers of ice that shouldn't have been possible in the middle of July. I left the Park Service a few months later and spent the rest of my life tracking similar disappearances across the Northeast. There were more than you'd think, patterns hidden in old reports and newspaper clippings that no one ever connected. But I connected them, and every time I found one, it felt like a piece of that night was staring back at me. I don't know if it's really gone, or if it's just waiting for its next chance. But if you ever find yourself alone in a foggy forest and hear someone calling your name, don't answer. My name is Marjorie Westbrook. I'm a ranger at Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland. It's a beautiful place, full of marshlands, winding waterways, and wildlife. But this summer, something feels wrong. The heat has been unbearable, like the air itself is pressing down on you. The humidity makes it hard to breathe, and every evening, electrical storms roll through the area like clockwork. The sunsets, once golden and peaceful, now turn the water blood red. It's unsettling. I've spent most of my life studying nature. Before I became a ranger, I was a marine biologist. I left that world behind after exposing a company for dumping chemicals into rivers and covering it up. It cost me my career, but I couldn't stay silent. Now I work here in the marshlands, doing what I can to protect this fragile ecosystem. Lately, though, things have been happening that I can't explain. The water looks strange, too still sometimes, almost unnatural, and there are patches of red algae blooming everywhere. Birds that should be migrating north are flying in circles over the marshes instead. And the smell, it's hard to describe. It's like ozone mixed with something metallic like copper. I've been using my water testing kit to figure out what's going on, but the results don't make sense. Levels of chemicals that shouldn't exist are showing up in my samples, things that aren't even supposed to be in nature. At first, I thought my equipment was malfunctioning, so I checked it over and even tested it elsewhere. But everything works fine outside the refuge. Something is wrong here. Something big. This morning started like any other day. I packed my camera and testing kit into my boat and headed out to check on some areas where the algae blooms were spreading faster than usual. The marshlands looked peaceful at first glance, the water shimmering under the sunlight and herons wading through the shallows, but there was an eerie quietness hanging over everything. As I steered deeper into the refuge, I noticed something strange near one of the fishing spots locals use. A small boat was washed ashore with no one inside, just empty nets and gear scattered around like someone left in a hurry. The hull was covered in barnacles that looked odd. They weren't normal barnacles. They were bigger and had strange patterns etched into their shells. I took some photos and samples before moving on, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me all day. The next few days only made things stranger. I couldn't stop thinking about that abandoned boat and those weird barnacles. Something about it didn't sit right with me. People don't just leave their boats like that, especially not the watermen around here. They're careful and experienced. And those barnacles, I've never seen anything like them before. I decided to focus on the area where I found the boat. It's a quiet part of the refuge, surrounded by tall reeds and twisting channels. Normally it's full of life, fish splashing, frogs croaking, birds calling, but when I arrived, it was dead silent. No movement, no sound. Just still water and the rustling of marsh grass in the breeze. I dropped my sampling net into the water to see what I could find. When I pulled it back up, my stomach turned. Inside were creatures that shouldn't exist. Fish with extra fins or twisted bodies, crabs with strange growths on their shells, and tiny eels that glowed faintly in the dim light. It was like something had warped them, changed them into, I don't even know what. I took samples and wrote everything down in my notebook, but the unease was growing stronger. As I worked, I noticed something else. My equipment was acting up. My GPS kept losing signal, and my compass spun wildly whenever I got close to certain parts of the marsh. Even my camera started glitching when I tried to take pictures of the water. Then there were the sounds, or maybe the lack of them. At first, it was just silence, which was eerie enough on its own. But then I started hearing faint noises coming from beneath the water. It wasn't fish or frogs or anything natural. It sounded like whispers, soft and distant, like voices carried on the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired or overthinking things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found another boat washed ashore in a different part of the refuge. This one had deep scratches along its sides, like something had clawed at it from below. There were no signs of its owner, just more strange barnacles clinging to the wood. I reported everything to my supervisor and even contacted a few scientists I used to work with back in my marine biology days. They all gave me the same response. It's probably just pollution or you're reading too much into it. No one wanted to listen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't normal pollution or some random natural phenomenon. It felt deliberate, like something or someone was behind it. That evening, as I sat on my porch going through my notes, a storm rolled in. The sky turned dark so quickly it felt like night had fallen early. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and flashes of lightning lit up the marshlands in bursts of white light. And then I saw it. For just a moment, so brief, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. I saw something move in the water near my dock, a shape rising up before disappearing beneath the surface again. It was too far away to make out any details, but it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen before. I stayed up late that night, staring out at the marshlands from my window. The storm passed eventually, leaving everything quiet again, but I couldn't sleep. Something is out there. I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw near the dock. It wasn't just my imagination, I was sure of it. Something had moved out there, something big. But what? A fish? A log caught in the current? No, it was something else. The next day, I decided to head back to the marshlands where I'd found the abandoned boats. I needed answers. The air felt heavier than usual, like the heat and humidity were pressing down harder than ever. Even the sunlight seemed different, brighter but harsher, reflecting off the water in blinding flashes. As I steered my boat deeper into the refuge, I noticed the water behaving strangely. It wasn't flowing the way it should. The currents were moving against the wind, almost like they had a mind of their own. I tried not to let it get to me, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel. I stopped near a patch of reeds and dropped my sampling net again. The water was so still it felt unnatural, like glass. As I waited for the net to sink, I heard something, a faint splashing sound coming from behind me. I turned quickly, scanning the area, but there was nothing there. Calm down, I whispered to myself. It's probably just a fish. But then it happened again, this time closer. I grabbed my camera and stood up carefully, trying not to rock the boat. My heart was pounding as I aimed toward where I thought the sound had come from. For a moment, everything was quiet again, too quiet. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a cluster of reeds sticking out of the water, but as I stared, the shape began to change. The reeds twisted together, forming something that looked almost human. Arms made of tangled vegetation reached out from the water, and its head, if you could call it that, was a writhing mass of eels and crabs moving in perfect unison. I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. Nothing like this should exist. The creature moved slowly toward a man standing on the opposite shore, a poacher who must have been trespassing in the refuge. He didn't see it at first. He was too busy setting traps in the shallow water, but when he finally turned around, his face went pale. He tried to run, but it was too late. The creature surged forward with shocking speed, wrapping him in its tangled limbs before pulling him into the water. His scream echoed across the marsh before cutting off suddenly. I wanted to help. I wanted to do something, but my body wouldn't move. All I could do was watch as the creature dragged him under until there was nothing left but ripples on the surface. For what felt like an eternity, I sat frozen in my boat, staring at where he'd disappeared. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on to my camera. When I finally managed to pull myself together, I started rowing back toward the dock as fast as I could. My motor had stopped working for some reason, another equipment failure, but I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get out of there. By the time I reached safety, my mind was racing with questions. What was that thing? How long has it been here? And why is no one talking about it? I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore this anymore. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. The creature, the way it moved, the way it dragged that man under, like he weighed nothing. I kept hearing his scream in my head, over and over. I knew I had to figure out what was going on, but I was terrified. What if it came for me next? The next morning, I forced myself to go back to work. I told myself I'd stay close to the main dock and avoid the deeper parts of the marsh, but deep down I knew that wouldn't be enough. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't staying in one place. I started going through old reports from the refuge, incident logs, missing persons cases, anything that might give me a clue. What I found made my stomach turn. Over the past few decades, there had been dozens of unexplained disappearances in and around the marshlands. Fishermen who never came home. Hikers who vanished without a trace, even a few rangers who went missing while on duty. Most of these cases were written off as accidents, people falling into the water or getting lost in the dense marshes. But now I wasn't so sure. The more I read, the more it felt like something had been lurking here for a long time, hidden in plain sight. I also started digging into records about industrial activity upstream. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Reports of chemical dumping in nearby rivers going back years. Most of it had been swept under the rug or dismissed as minor violations, but some of the chemicals listed were known to cause mutations in aquatic life. It all started to fit together, the strange creatures in my sampling nets, the unnatural algae blooms, and now this thing. Whatever was happening here wasn't just nature taking its course, something had pushed it over the edge. I tried reaching out to a few people for help, scientists, local authorities, but no one took me seriously. They either thought I was exaggerating or trying to scare people for attention. One even laughed and said, "You've been out in the sun too long." That afternoon, my junior ranger assistant Ben came by to check on me. He was young and eager, always asking questions about the marshlands and how things worked. I thought about telling him what I'd seen but decided against it. He wouldn't believe me anyway. Instead, we went out together to check on some of the refuge's monitoring equipment. As we approached one of the more remote areas, I felt that same heavy stillness in the air, the kind that makes your skin crawl. The water looked darker here, almost black, and there was a faint smell of ozone hanging in the air. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked suddenly. I stopped rowing and listened. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard it, a low humming sound coming from beneath the water. It wasn't natural. It sounded mechanical somehow, like an engine running underwater. Before I could say anything, something splashed near the boat. Ben leaned over to look, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Don't set," I said sharply. "Stay still." The water around us began to ripple as if something massive was moving just below the surface. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. And then it appeared. The creature rose up slowly from the water about 20 feet away from us. Its body was a horrifying mix of tangled plants and writhing sea creatures, eels twisting through its limbs and crabs scuttling across its surface like armor. Its head turned toward us, and though it didn't have eyes or a face, I could feel it watching us. Ben let out a choked gasp and scrambled backward in the boat. "What is that?" he whispered. "I don't set no," I said quietly. "But don't set move." The creature didn't attack right away. It just stood there in the water, swaying slightly as if deciding what to do next. Then it started moving toward us. "Go!" I shouted at Ben as I grabbed an oar and started paddling as hard as I could. The creature followed us for a while, but eventually stopped when we reached shallower water near one of the main channels. It sank back into the depths without a sound. When we got back to shore, Ben was pale and shaking. He kept asking me what we saw, but all I could say was that we needed to report it right away. But deep down, I knew no one would believe us, not until it was too late. I didn't go back to the marsh for 2 days after that encounter. I told myself I needed time to think. But the truth was, I was scared. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just some mutated animal. It was something far worse. It felt alive in a way that was hard to explain, like it wasn't just a creature but something intelligent. Ben didn't come back to work either. He called in sick, and I didn't blame him. I hadn't told anyone else what we saw, but I could tell he wasn't going to forget it anytime soon. On the 3rd day, I woke up to another storm rolling in. The sky was dark and heavy with clouds, and the wind rattled my windows as I got ready for work. Something about the storm felt different, stronger, angrier, like it was building towards something. I decided to head out to the marsh one last time. I couldn't explain why. I just felt like I needed to face it. Maybe it was guilt for not stopping what happened to that poacher, or maybe it was just desperation to understand what was happening here. Either way, I packed my camera, my water testing kit, and a portable speaker loaded with recordings of industrial machinery sounds. It was a long shot, but if this thing really was connected to pollution, maybe those sounds would affect it somehow. By the time I reached the dock, the storm was in full swing. Lightning flashed across the sky every few seconds, and thunder boomed so loudly it felt like the ground was shaking. The water was choppy and dark, but I pushed off anyway, steering my boat toward the deeper parts of the refuge. As I got closer to where we'd seen the creature before, everything went quiet again. The wind died down, and even the rain seemed to stop for a moment. It was like stepping into a different world, a world where nothing moved except me. And then I saw it. The creature rose up from the water ahead of me, taller than before, its body twisting and shifting as if it were made of living shadows. Heels slithered through its limbs, and crabs clung to its surface like armor. The air around it crackled with energy, tiny sparks of electricity jumping from one part of its body to another. It didn't attack right away. Instead, it seemed to be studying me, waiting for me to make the first move. My hands were shaking as I reached for the speaker and turned it on. The sound of grinding machinery filled the air, loud and harsh, like metal scraping against metal. The creature recoiled slightly at first, but then started moving toward me again, faster this time. I cranked up the volume as high as it would go and aimed the speaker directly at it. The sound seemed to disrupt its movements. It stumbled and swayed as if struggling to hold itself together. But then lightning struck nearby, and everything changed. The bolt hit the water with a deafening crack, sending waves crashing against my boat. The creature let out a sound, a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through my chest and surged forward with terrifying speed. I grabbed an oar and swung it at one of its limbs as it reached for me. The impact sent eels scattering across the deck of my boat, but more took their place almost instantly. "Leave me alone," I shouted as I swung again. The creature paused for a moment before reaching out again. Not with violence this time, but with something else entirely. Its limbs brushed against my head lightly, almost gently, and suddenly my mind was flooded with images. I saw rivers choked with garbage and chemicals pouring into streams, fish dying in massive numbers, while birds fell from the sky. Entire ecosystems collapsing under the weight of human destruction. It wasn't attacking me, it was showing me why it existed. Tears streamed down my face as I fought against the visions. "Stop," I screamed. "I get it. Just stop." The creature hesitated before slowly sinking back into the water. The images faded from my mind as its body dissolved into smaller parts, eels slipping away into the depths while crabs scuttled across the surface toward shore. When it finally disappeared completely, I collapsed onto the deck of my boat, shaking uncontrollably. When I finally made it back to shore, I felt like I was in a daze. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely tie the boat to the dock. The storm had passed, leaving the marshlands eerily quiet again. But I knew things would never feel normal here, not for me. I sat in my truck for what felt like hours, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked pale and hollow, like I'd aged 10 years overnight. My mind was still reeling from everything the creature had shown me. The images of destruction, the overwhelming pain of a dying ecosystem. It wasn't just a monster, it was something more. Something born from the suffering of this place, from all the chemicals and garbage we'd poured into its waters over decades. It wasn't evil, it was desperate. And now that I'd seen what it was fighting against, I couldn't blame it. The next few weeks were a blur. I reported everything to my supervisor and even sent my notes and photos to a few environmental organizations, but no one believed me. They said my equipment must have been faulty, or that I'd exaggerated what I saw because of stress or exhaustion. Ben quit his job. Not long after that, he told me he couldn't handle being out in the marshlands anymore, not after what happened. I didn't blame him. Part of me wanted to leave too, but something kept me here. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was a sense of responsibility. Either way, I couldn't walk away. Over time, word started spreading among the locals about strange things happening in the refuge, boats disappearing, weird noises coming from the water at night, and sightings of something moving just below the surface. Some people dismissed it as rumors or superstition, but others started taking precautions. The watermen, who fished near the refuge, began playing specific sounds underwater before casting their nets, low-frequency tones that seemed to keep the creature away. They didn't know why it worked, they just knew it did. As for me, I wasn't the same after that day. The visions the creature showed me didn't go away. They stayed with me, popping into my mind at random times like flashes of memory that weren't mine. Sometimes they were so vivid it felt like I was living through them all over again. But something strange happened too. I started noticing patterns in nature that other people couldn't see. I could predict when certain fish populations would crash or when algae blooms would spread faster than usual. It was like the creature had left part of itself inside me, a connection to the marshlands and everything living within them. People started calling me the marsh prophet as word got around about my predictions. At first I hated it, it felt like a joke, but over time, I realized it wasn't meant to be cruel. They were just trying to make sense of what was happening. The refuge eventually reopened with restricted areas marked off as unsafe. Officially, they blamed pollution for the problems in those zones, but I knew better. The creature was still out there, detoxifying the marsh bit by bit in its own way. Sometimes, when storms roll through and lightning lights up the water, I think I see it again, just for a moment, rising up before disappearing into the depths once more. I don't know if it'll ever leave this place or if it'll ever stop fighting against what we've done here. But one thing is certain, this isn't just its home, it's its battlefield. And we serve part of that fight now too. My name is Gabriel Morales, and I've spent most of my life trying to find peace. After surviving the chaos of World War II, I thought I'd finally found it here, working as a park ranger in the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. The desert has a way of calming the soul, you know? It's quiet, timeless. The fossilized trees scattered across the painted desert look like they've been here forever, untouched by the world's madness. But lately, something hasn't felt right. It was autumn of 1953, and the weather had been strange. Dust storms would roll in without warning, choking the air and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, as if nature wanted to apologize, the nights would clear up so completely that you could see every star in the sky. They were unnaturally bright, almost too bright, like they were watching us. I'd always been practical. Science made sense to me. It helped me understand the land and its secrets. But growing up, my grandfather used to tell me stories about spirits that lived in the desert, the kind that didn't like being disturbed. He gave me a silver medallion of St. Michael for protection when I was just a boy. I still wear it every day, but lately, it's been acting strange. In certain parts of the park, it starts to tarnish, like something's eating away at it. That morning started like any other. I was leading a small group of tourists on a guided tour through the park's trails. There were families with kids asking questions about the petrified wood, couples taking pictures of the colorful rock formations. It was normal stuff. But as we walked deeper into the park, I noticed something odd. Some of the fossilized trees looked different. Their shapes seemed wrong, like they'd shifted overnight. I brushed it off at first. Maybe I was imagining things. But then one of the tourists pointed out something that made my stomach drop. "Hey," he said, "isn't that log supposed to be over there? I swear I saw it on the other side yesterday." I laughed nervously and told him it was just his memory playing tricks on him. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As we continued walking, I felt uneasy. The wind had picked up again, carrying whispers through the canyon. At least that's what it sounded like. It wasn't just me. Some of the tourists started looking around like they could hear it too. By the time we reached one of the park's lookout points, things had calmed down a bit. The group was snapping photos and chatting while I stood off to the side scanning the horizon. That's when I noticed something strange in the distance, a figure standing perfectly still near a cluster of petrified logs. At first I thought it was another tourist who'd wandered off from another group, but as I squinted to get a better look, something about them seemed wrong. They weren't moving at all, not even shifting their weight or adjusting their stance like a normal person would after standing for so long. "Hey," I called out, waving my arm to get their attention. No response. I decided to walk closer to check things out, just doing my job as a ranger, but when I turned back to tell my group where I was going, they were gone. Every single one of them had vanished without a sound or trace. I stood there frozen, staring at the empty trail where my group had been just moments ago. My heart started pounding in my chest. I called out, "Hello? Where are you guys?" My voice echoed across the canyon, but there was no reply. The only sound was the wind, which had picked up again, carrying that strange whispering noise. I hurried back to where the group had been standing, hoping they'd just wandered off. But all I found was a camera lying on the ground. It belonged to one of the tourists, a young man who'd been snapping pictures non-stop during the hike. The camera looked odd, though. Its edges were rough and jagged, like it had been left out in the desert for years. When I picked it up, I realized why. Part of it had turned to stone. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at the petrified camera in my hands. This wasn't normal. Cameras don't just turn into rock. Something was very, very wrong. I tried to stay calm and think logically. Maybe they'd gotten scared and run back to the visitor center, Maybe the camera was just some weird prank or experiment someone left behind. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't make sense. I followed the trail back toward the parking lot, calling out for the group as I went. That's when I noticed something else. Tracks on the ground. At first they looked like regular footprints, but as I followed them farther, they started to change. The prints became longer and narrower, like an animal's paws. Then they changed again, deep impressions in the dirt that looked like chunks of stone had been pressed into the ground. The tracks led me toward a rocky area of the park where visitors weren't supposed to go without a guide. As I climbed over a ridge, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A line of petrified logs arranged in a perfect circle. They hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. I felt like I was being watched. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. My grandfather's medallion started to feel warm against my chest, and when I glanced down at it, I saw that it was tarnished again, darker than ever before. Okay, I muttered to myself, trying to steady my breathing. Just stay calm. I decided to head back to the visitor center and call for help. Whatever was going on here wasn't something I could handle alone. When I got back to the main building, I told my supervisor what had happened. He looked at me like I was crazy at first, until I showed him the petrified camera and described the tracks. His face went pale. "We need to call someone," he said quietly. A few hours later, a group of people arrived. Military investigators dressed in plain clothes but carrying equipment that looked way too advanced for anything we had at the park. They didn't say much to me or anyone else. They just started scanning the area and asking questions about radiation levels. Radiation, that word made my stomach turn. There'd been rumors about nuclear testing happening nearby, secret government projects, but no one ever talked about it openly. One of the investigators pulled me aside and asked if I'd seen anything unusual, figures in the distance, strange formations in the rocks, things like that. When I mentioned the figure standing near the petrified logs earlier that day, his expression changed. "You need to stay away from areas like that," he said firmly. "If you see anything else, don't instead approach it." He wouldn't set to explain why. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin trying to make sense of everything, I heard something outside, a faint grinding sound, like stone scraping against stone. The sound outside my cabin was faint at first, but it grew louder, like someone or something was dragging heavy stones across the ground. I sat frozen in my chair, gripping the edge of the table. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I stood up slowly and grabbed my flashlight. The cabin was surrounded by desert, so there wasn't much out there except sand, rocks, and the occasional coyote. But this sound wasn't natural. It didn't belong. I stepped onto the porch and shined the flashlight into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just the usual shadows cast by the petrified logs scattered around the park. But then, off to the side near a cluster of rocks, I saw movement, a figure standing perfectly still. It was the same one I'd seen earlier near the petrified logs. It hadn't moved an inch since I first spotted it that morning. It was just standing there, staring in my direction, or at least I thought it was staring. Its eyes were dark and shiny, like polished obsidian, and they didn't reflect the light from my flashlight. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound confident, even though my voice shook a little. "This is private property. You're not supposed to be here." No response. I took a step forward, shining the light directly on it. That's when I realized something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't human. Its skin looked rough and uneven, like it was made of stone instead of flesh. Its arms hung stiffly at its sides, but its fingers were twisted into shapes that reminded me of tree roots or animal claws. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The grinding sound started again, but this time it was louder, closer. Suddenly, the figure moved. Its arms stretched out toward me, and for a moment, I thought it was going to grab me, but instead, its hand transformed right before my eyes. The fingers turned into jagged pieces of rock that glowed faintly in the moonlight. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. My breathing was ragged as I leaned against the door, trying to calm down. The grinding sound continued outside for what felt like hours before finally fading away. The next morning, I went to check on one of my fellow rangers, Tom, who'd been patrolling a different part of the park overnight. He hadn't checked in yet, which wasn't like him. When I found him near one of the trails, he was sitting on the ground with his back against a rock formation. At first, I thought he was just resting, but then I saw his face. Tom's left arm had turned completely to stone. His skin looked cracked and brittle, like it would crumble if you touched it. He was still conscious but barely able to speak. "It touched me," he whispered weakly. "Done set? Let it touch you." I called for help immediately, but when the military investigators arrived again later that day, they didn't seem surprised by what had happened to Tom. In fact, they almost seemed prepared for it. One of them pulled me aside again and said something that chilled me to the bone. "This isn't set just radiation we set you're dealing with here. There's set something older, something tied to this land." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those obsidian-like eyes staring back at me. And then there were the whispers, the ones carried by the wind through the canyon. They sounded almost human now, but not quite. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every sound, every shadow outside my cabin felt like it was alive. I kept the lights on all night, but I knew that wouldn't stop whatever was out there. Tom's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't let it touch you." The next morning, I decided I couldn't face this alone anymore. I drove into town to visit a Navajo elder named Ben Yazzie. He'd helped the park before with cultural consultations, and I remembered him telling me stories about the land, stories about things that didn't belong to our world. When I explained what had happened, Ben listened quietly, his weathered face showing no surprise. "You've disturbed something ancient," he said finally. "It's not just the radiation from those tests. The land remembers everything, every step, every mistake. This creature, it's a guardian." "A guardian of what?" I asked. Ben stared at me for a long moment before answering. "Of balance. It punishes those who take what doesn't belong to them." I thought of all the tourists who ignored the signs and took pieces of petrified wood home as souvenirs. Could that really be what had awakened this thing? It sounded ridiculous, but after everything I'd seen, I wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Ben agreed to help me, but he warned me it wouldn't be easy. "This creature is tied to the land," he said. "You can kill it. Not in the way you stir thinking, but you can trap it." We spent the afternoon preparing a plan. Ben said moving water could disrupt the creature's abilities, so we decided to lure it into an ancient riverbed that still flooded during heavy rains. The military investigators reluctantly agreed to help after seeing what had happened to Tom. They provided equipment and kept watch on the park while we worked. That evening, as storm clouds began gathering on the horizon, I felt a strange mix of fear and determination. My arm still burned where the creature had grazed me during its first attack, and I'd noticed something terrifying. Small patches of my skin were starting to harden, turning gray and rough like stone. I didn't tell anyone about it, not yet. As night fell, Ben performed a ceremony near the riverbed, chanting in Navajo while sprinkling herbs around the area. He said it would help draw the creature in, though he couldn't guarantee it would work. We waited in silence for hours, listening to the distant rumble of thunder as the storm approached. The air was thick with tension, and every gust of wind felt like it carried whispers from unseen voices. Then we heard it, the grinding sound of stone against stone. It was coming closer. I shined my flashlight toward the trail leading into the riverbed and saw the figure emerge from the darkness. Its obsidian-like eyes gleamed in the light, and its body shifted as it walked, parts of it transforming into rock, wood, and animal shapes with every step. Ben stood firm beside me, chanting louder as the creature approached. The military team stayed back, ready with their equipment but clearly terrified. The creature stopped just short of entering the riverbed, its gaze fixed on me. It raised one arm slowly, and I saw its fingers begin to change again, this time into sharp spikes of stone. I stepped forward despite every instinct screaming at me to run. My grandfather's medallion felt heavy against my chest as I gripped my geological hammer tightly in one hand. "You don't belong here," I said aloud, my voice shaking but steady enough to carry through the canyon. The creature tilted its head slightly, as if considering my words or mocking them. Then it lunged. I barely had time to react as its arm swung toward me. I dodged to the side, feeling its sharp stone fingers graze my shoulder. Pain shot through me like fire as more of my skin began hardening into stone. Then shouted something in Navajo behind me, words I didn't understand, and suddenly there was a loud crack of thunder overhead. Rain began pouring down in sheets, flooding the riverbed within minutes. The creature hesitated as water pooled around its feet. Its body started shifting uncontrollably, stone turning back into flesh and then into wood before cycling again. It seemed weaker now, struggling against whatever force was disrupting its transformation. "Now," Ben yelled. With all my strength, I swung my geological hammer at one of its legs, knocking it off balance and sending it tumbling into the rushing water below. The creature thrashed wildly as the current pulled it deeper into the riverbed. Its obsidian eyes locked onto mine one last time before its body froze mid-transformation, a grotesque mix of stone, wood, and flesh trapped in place by the floodwaters. Ben's chanting slowed as he stepped forward cautiously, inspecting what remained of the creature. "It's done," he said quietly. I collapsed onto the ground, exhausted and trembling from pain and fear. The storm finally passed, leaving behind a calm so quiet it felt unnatural. The creature was gone, frozen mid-transformation in the riverbed. Its body was a grotesque mix of stone, wood, and flesh, locked in place by the rushing water. Ben stood beside me, his face somber but steady. "It's not dead," he said softly. "It's just trapped." I didn't reply. My arm was burning again, the patches of hardened skin spreading farther up toward my shoulder. I knew what it meant. I'd been touched by the creature, and part of me was becoming like it. The military team packed up their equipment and left without much explanation. They didn't want this story getting out. They told us to say the deaths and injuries were caused by radiation exposure from nearby testing. It wasn't the truth. But who would believe the real story anyway? Tom didn't survive. The petrification spread too far, turning his body into solid stone before anyone could help him. His death hit me hard. I'd worked with him for years, and now he was just gone. Ben performed another ceremony at the park's edge before leaving. He said the land needed balance again and warned me to keep an eye on the boundaries. "This isn't over," he said before driving away. I stayed at the park for a while longer, but things were never the same after that night. I started wearing gloves to hide my petrified hand. It was a reminder of what I'd faced and what I'd lost. The government tightened regulations at the park, enforcing rules against removing petrified wood with almost religious zeal. Visitors didn't know why, they just followed the signs and warnings. As for me, I couldn't let it go. Wherever I went, I kept watching for signs. Geological anomalies, strange tracks, whispers in the wind. The land remembers everything. My name is Daniel Nakamura, and I've been a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park for over a decade. Winter is my favorite season. Even though it's the most dangerous time of year, there's something peaceful about the snow-covered trees and the quiet that comes with it. I've always loved the challenge of working in harsh conditions. It's like solving a puzzle where lives depend on getting it right. That winter, 1987, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The snow just wouldn't stop. Day after day, the blizzards rolled in, piling up more snow than anyone thought possible. It was beautiful at first, a pristine wonderland stretched out as far as the eye could see. But soon things started to feel off. It began during one of our training exercises. My team of seasonal rangers was learning how to navigate avalanche terrain and rescue hikers who might get trapped. We were skiing through a valley when I noticed something strange in the snow, a pattern that didn't belong there. Perfectly straight lines crisscrossed the ground, forming shapes that looked almost geometric. Squares, triangles, circles, all carved into the snow like someone had drawn them with a ruler. "Hey, do you see this?" I called out to my team. They gathered around me, staring at the patterns with puzzled expressions. "Maybe it's just the wind," one of them said. But I knew better. Wind doesn't make shapes like that, not in snow this deep. I brushed it off and told myself it was nothing. We had work to do, and I couldn't let my imagination distract me. But as the days went on, more strange things started happening. One morning, while checking my equipment, I noticed my altimeter was acting up. It's a custom device I built myself, reliable as anything you'll find on the market, but now it was giving me readings that didn't make sense. According to the numbers, we were thousands of feet higher than we should have been. Faulty battery? I muttered under my breath and put it away. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The weather wasn't helping either. The blizzards were relentless, but there was something else mixed in, something unnatural. The air felt heavy, like static electricity before a lightning strike. Radios crackled with interference every time we tried to use them, cutting us off from the outside world. I told myself it was just bad luck, just another tough winter in the mountains, but deep down I knew this wasn't normal. The snow kept falling, heavier than ever. It felt like the mountains were trying to bury us alive. I was out on patrol one morning, checking for signs of avalanche risk, when I stumbled across something that made me stop in my tracks. At first, I thought it was just a pile of snow, a mound pushed up by the wind, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just snow, it was ice. And inside the ice was a person. I froze, staring at the figure trapped in the frozen block. It was a backpacker, a young man, maybe in his 20s, curled up like he'd been trying to protect himself from the cold. His face was pale, his lips blue, but he wasn't dead. Somehow, he was still alive. I dropped to my knees and started digging around the ice with my gloves. "Hey, can you hear me?" I shouted. He didn't respond. His chest moved just barely, slow, shallow breaths that didn't make sense for someone trapped like this. My heart was pounding as I radioed back to the ranger station. "I've got a hiker encased in ice, alive but unresponsive," I said. Static crackled through the speaker before the line went dead. The radio wasn't working again. I looked down at him and felt a chill run through me, not from the cold, but from something deeper. How could someone survive being frozen like this? It wasn't natural. I managed to chip away enough ice to free his upper body and wrapped him in my emergency blanket. His skin felt cold, colder than anything I'd ever touched, but there was still life in him. I strapped him onto my sled and started skiing back toward the station as fast as I could. When I arrived, the other rangers crowded around me, their faces full of shock and confusion. "What happened?" one of them asked. "I don't set no," I said honestly. "He sets alive, but barely." We placed him near the fireplace and tried everything we could to warm him up. Hot packs, blankets, even CPR, but nothing worked. His body temperature wouldn't rise no matter what we did. That's when I noticed something strange on his skin. Faint lines crisscrossing his arms and legs, almost like scars but too perfect to be natural. They looked just like the geometric patterns we'd seen in the snow. "Do you think this has something to do with those shapes?" one of the rangers asked nervously. "I don't know," I said again, but deep down I was starting to think it did. As night fell, the weather outside grew worse. The wind howled against the windows and snow piled up higher than ever before. The backpacker lay motionless by the fire, his breathing so faint it was hard to tell if he was still alive. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those patterns in the snow and those scars on his skin and felt like something was watching us from outside. The next morning, I woke up to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that makes your stomach twist. The wind had stopped, but it didn't feel like a break in the storm. It felt wrong. I stepped outside the station to check the snow levels. The air was heavy, like it was holding its breath. The snow around the building was untouched, perfectly smooth, except for one thing: tracks. They weren't animal tracks or boot prints. They were long, thin lines that curved and looped in strange patterns, stretching out into the trees. They reminded me of the shapes we'd seen in the snow before, but these weren't just shapes, they were trails. Something had been moving out there. I called for my team to come take a look. "Does this mean someone else is out here?" one of them asked. "I don't think so," I said quietly. The lines didn't look like anything a person or even an animal could make. They were too precise, too deliberate. We decided to follow them, hoping they might lead us to some answers, or at least give us a clue about what was going on. I took point, my skis cutting through the fresh snow as we moved deeper into the forest. The tracks led us to a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal something I'll never forget, a massive circle carved into the snow, perfectly symmetrical and so large it must have taken hours, maybe days, to create. At the center of the circle was a single tree, its bark stripped away to reveal smooth wood underneath. "What is this?" one of my rangers whispered. "I don't know," I said again. It was becoming my go-to answer lately. As we approached the tree, I noticed something carved into its surface, symbols that looked ancient, like they belonged in a museum or an old book about Native American legends. I reached out to touch them, and as soon as my fingers brushed the wood, I felt a jolt run through me, like static electricity but stronger. I pulled my hand back and stared at it, half expecting to see burn marks or something. "We need to get back," I said quickly. "Now." We turned around and started skiing back toward the station, but something didn't feel right. The forest seemed darker than before, even though it was only midday. The air felt colder too, so cold it burned when I breathed in. When we finally made it back to the station, we found another surprise waiting for us. An avalanche had come down while we were gone, blocking off the main road. We were officially trapped. "Great," one of my rangers muttered. "Now what?" "We wait," I said firmly. "We shall figure this out." But deep down, I wasn't set so sure. That night, as we huddled inside trying to stay warm, I couldn't stop thinking about those symbols on the tree and about the backpacker still lying by the fire. His breathing hadn't changed since we found him. It was still slow and shallow, like he was stuck in some kind of frozen limbo. Then there was a sound, a faint tapping coming from outside. It wasn't wind or snow falling off the roof. It was deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just enough to shine it outside. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on something that made my blood run cold. More tracks in the snow, but this time they were closer than ever before. Something was out there with us. The tapping didn't stop. It was slow and steady, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. I stood at the door, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rest of the team stayed behind me, silent and tense. "Stay inside," I whispered to them. "I still check it out." I stepped out into the snow, my boots crunching loudly in the eerie silence. The cold hit me like a wall. It was sharper than anything I'd felt before, biting through my jacket and gloves like they weren't even there. My breath fogged up in front of me as I scanned the area with my flashlight. That sips when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another tree, a tall, thin figure standing perfectly still among the others. But then it moved. It was slow, almost graceful, as it stepped forward into the beam of my flashlight. My heart stopped. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't even human. The thing was tall, at least 8 feet, and its skin looked like ice, translucent and smooth, with shadowy shapes moving underneath. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in sharp points that looked like icicles. But the worst part was its head, crowned with antler-like branches that seemed to hum faintly, like they were picking up signals from the air. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as it tilted its head toward me, those antlers twitching slightly as if it was studying me. Then it took another step forward. "Get back," I shouted, my voice cracking as I stumbled backward toward the door. The creature didn't stop. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculated, as it closed the distance between us. I scrambled inside and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. "There's something out there," I said breathlessly to the team. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. "I don't know what it is," I said honestly. The tapping started again, this time louder and faster. It wasn't coming from one spot anymore. It sounded like it was all around us, echoing off the walls of the station. Then we heard another sound, a faint scraping noise coming from the roof. "It steps on top of us," someone whispered. I grabbed my radio and tried to call for help again, but all I got was static. The interference was worse than ever now, cutting off every attempt to reach anyone outside. "We need to stay together," I said firmly. "No one goes outside, not for any reason." We huddled in the center of the room, our eyes darting toward every sound that came from outside or above us. The fire crackled weakly in the corner, barely enough to keep us warm against the freezing air that seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. Hours passed like this, long stretches of silence broken by sudden noises that made us jump every time. Then came another sound. Footsteps crunching in the snow just outside the door. This time they weren't slow or deliberate. They were frantic, like someone running for their life. "Help, please." A voice screamed from outside. I froze again. It sounded like a man, a hiker maybe, but something about his voice didn't feel right. It was too high-pitched, too desperate, almost like he was mimicking what he thought a human would sound like. "Don't open it," one of my rangers said quickly. I hesitated for a moment before stepping toward the door again. "What if someone's really out there?" I said quietly. "You saw what's out there," they replied firmly. The footsteps stopped suddenly right outside the door, and everything went quiet again. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping didn't stop. It was relentless, like a clock ticking down to something I didn't want to face. My team sat huddled together near the fire, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke. No one even moved. We were all waiting, listening, for whatever was going to happen next. The temperature inside the station was dropping fast. The fire wasn't enough anymore. It felt like the cold was seeping in through the walls, freezing everything from the inside out. I checked the thermostat. It was reading below zero, which didn't make any sense. We were indoors. This shouldn't have been possible. "It sets messing with us," I said quietly. "Whatever it is, it sets playing games." One of the rangers looked at me with wide eyes. "What do you mean?" I hesitated before answering. "It sits controlling the cold somehow. It wants us to panic." The tapping turned into scratching, a slow, deliberate sound that ran along the walls and windows like claws scraping against glass. Every now and then, we'd hear footsteps crunching in the snow outside, circling the building like a predator stalking its prey. "We can stay here," one of my team members said suddenly. "We set sitting ducks." "And go where?" I shot back. "The roads are blocked, and whatever sips out there will follow us." Silence fell again as we all stared at each other, trying to come up with a plan we knew didn't exist. Then came another sound, a loud crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. The windows frosted over instantly, ice spreading across the glass in jagged patterns that looked almost alive. "It sets trying to get in," someone whispered. I grabbed my backpack and started digging through it for anything useful. Flare guns, emergency blankets, even food supplies, anything that might help us survive whatever was coming next. That's when I remembered something: geothermal vents. Mount Rainier had several hot springs scattered throughout its lower elevations, places where heat from deep underground bubbled up to the surface. If this thing was controlling the cold, maybe heat was its weakness. "We need to get to the hot springs," I said suddenly. "What?" one of my rangers asked, staring at me like I'd lost my mind. "Heat," I explained quickly. "It seps freezing everything around us. It seps using cold as a weapon. If we can get to one of the geothermal vents, maybe we can fight back." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than sitting around waiting for whatever was outside to break in. We packed up what little gear we had left and prepared to make a run for it. The scratching on the walls grew louder as if it knew what we were planning. My hands shook as I loaded flares into my gun and strapped on my skis. "Stay together," I told them firmly. "No matter what happens, don't split up." We opened the door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit us like a punch to the gut, stealing our breath and numbing our fingers instantly despite our gloves. The snow was deeper than ever, forcing us to push through it with every step. The tracks were everywhere now, long lines crisscrossing in every direction like some kind of twisted maze designed to confuse us. But I kept my eyes forward, focusing on the route toward the nearest hot spring. That seps when I saw it again, the creature. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those antler-like branches twitching faintly in the wind. Its icy skin shimmered in the moonlight as it tilted its head toward us like it was deciding what to do next. "Don't stop," I shouted over my shoulder as we pushed forward. The creature moved suddenly, faster than anything that size should have been able to move, and started closing in on us with long strides that barely disturbed the snow beneath its feet. I fired a flare toward it without thinking, the bright red light streaking through the air before landing in front of it with a hiss. But it didn't even flinch. It just kept coming. "Go!" I yelled again as we reached the edge of a steep slope leading down toward one of the geothermal vents below. We skied down as fast as we could, dodging trees and rocks while trying not to lose control on the icy surface. The creature followed effortlessly, gliding across the snow like it was part of it. By the time we reached the bottom, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely stand. The hot spring bubbled ahead of us, steam rising from its surface like a beacon of hope in an otherwise frozen nightmare. "Get behind me," I told my team as I stepped forward toward the spring and turned to face the creature head-on. The steam rising from the hot spring felt like the only warmth I'd felt in days. My team stayed behind me, their breaths coming out in shaky clouds as they stared at the creature. It was standing just a few feet away now, towering over us like something out of a nightmare. Its icy skin glimmered faintly in the moonlight, and its antler-like branches twitched as if they were sensing the heat from the spring. For the first time, it hesitated. I gripped my flare gun tightly, my hands shaking as I tried to think of what to do next. The geothermal vent was our only chance, but I had no idea how to use it against something like this. All I knew was that we had to make it stop before it made us stop. "Stay back," I said firmly. Though my voice cracked halfway through, I wasn't sure if I was talking to my team or the creature itself. It tilted its head again, studying me with movements that felt too deliberate, too human, for something that clearly wasn't. Then it took another step forward. I fired another flare toward its feet. The bright red light hissed and sparked as it hit the snow, melting a small patch around it. The creature stopped again, its antlers twitching more violently now. "It doesn't like heat," I said quietly to myself. That's when an idea hit me. A desperate, reckless idea that might be our only shot. "We need to lure it into the ice cave," I said quickly to my team. "What? Are you crazy?" one of them asked. "There's an unstable ice cave near this spring," I explained. "If we can get it inside and trigger a collapse, maybe we can trap it." It wasn't set much of a plan, but it was all we had. The creature moved again. Faster this time. Its long limbs glided across the snow effortlessly as it closed the distance between us. My team scrambled backward toward the edge of the hot spring while I fired another flare to slow it down. "Go," I shouted as I turned and started skiing toward the ice cave. The others followed close behind me, their movements frantic as they tried to keep up. The cave wasn't far, just a few hundred yards, but every second felt like an eternity with that thing chasing us. The sound of its footsteps crunching in the snow grew louder and faster with each passing moment. When we reached the entrance, I stopped abruptly and turned around to face it again. The creature paused just outside the cave, its antlers twitching wildly now as if it could sense what we were trying to do. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. Just a little closer. It stepped forward slowly at first, then faster as it entered the cave. The walls shimmered faintly in the light from my flare gun, their icy surface reflecting distorted images of us and the creature. I backed up further into the cave until I reached a spot where I knew the ice was weakest, the place where avalanches had started before. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest as I raised my flare gun one last time. "Get out," I shouted to my team. "Now." They scrambled toward the entrance as I fired directly at the ceiling above me. The flare hissed loudly as it hit the ice, melting a small patch before triggering a loud crack that echoed through the cave. The walls began to tremble violently as chunks of ice broke free and crashed down around us. The creature let out a sound, a low, guttural noise that sent chills down my spine as it tried to move toward me again. But it was too late. The ceiling collapsed completely, burying everything, including me, in a rush of snow and ice that felt like being hit by a freight train. When I opened my eyes, everything was white. For a moment I thought I was dead, that the ice and snow had swallowed me whole, but then I felt the sharp sting of cold against my skin and realized I was still alive. Barely. I tried to move, but every part of my body felt frozen in place. My fingers wouldn't respond, and my legs felt like they were encased in concrete. The air was so cold it burned with every breath I took. All I could do was lie there, staring at the faint shimmer of light filtering through the snow above me. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. But eventually I heard voices. Faint at first, then louder as they got closer. "Daniel, can you hear us?" It was my team. Somehow, they'd managed to dig their way back into the cave and find me. When they pulled me out from under the snow, I couldn't speak or even move. My body was so cold it felt like it didn't belong to me anymore. They carried me back to the station and did everything they could to warm me up. Blankets, hot packs, even rubbing my hands and feet to get the blood flowing again. It worked enough to keep me alive, but something had changed. The cold had done something to me, something I couldn't explain. Even after I recovered enough to stand and walk again, I couldn't feel warmth the same way anymore. My skin was always cold to the touch, no matter how hot it was outside or how many layers I wore. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I could still feel that thing watching me, like it had left a part of itself behind. The official report blamed everything on freak weather conditions, a record-breaking blizzard combined with avalanches that cut off communications and trapped us in the park. No one mentioned the creature or what we saw in the snow. They said the backpacker we found had died from hypothermia before we reached him. They said my injuries were from falling debris during an avalanche. But we knew better. After we left Mount Rainier, some of us stayed in touch. At least for a while, we didn't talk about what happened directly. It was too hard to put into words, but every now and then, someone would mention strange dreams or feelings they couldn't shake, like they were being watched or followed. As for me, I couldn't go back to the mountains, not after what happened. Instead, I focused on something else, studying hypothermia and cold-related injuries. The backpacker we found had been frozen but alive, his body stuck in some kind of suspended animation that shouldn't have been possible. That idea stuck with me. Years later, I developed a new treatment for severe hypothermia based on what we saw that winter, a way to slow down vital functions just enough to keep people alive until help arrives. It saved lives, but every time someone thanked me for it, all I could think about was that creature and how close we came to not surviving at all. Mount Rainier still has strict winter safety protocols now, rules about ice formations and patterns in the snow that don't make sense unless you know what really happened out there. Indigenous groups quietly monitor certain areas during specific lunar phases too, though they don't talk about why. As for me, well, sometimes when it's quiet and cold enough outside, I swear I can hear tapping on my window,